Dear experts and participants in today's online workshop, Leaving No One Behind, Carbon Pricing Effects Across Households. The year 2020 was supposed to be an important year with many opportunities to bring climate change and climate protection to the center of public awareness. Instead, our attention was drawn to a pandemic which still holds the world hostage. While we are in the midst of fighting COVID-19, we must not lose sight of the fact that global warming and climate change continue to challenge mankind. And this challenge will still exist once we have succeeded to control the virus. What can be learned from the current health crisis is that national well-being always depends on global well-being. If the international community fails to fight global warming and climate change, we will all find ourselves in a very unsettled world. Therefore, it takes joint and determined actions to prepare for a resilient and sustainable future. In order to achieve the climate goals set out in the Paris Agreement, everyone in the international community must make their contribution. Dear participants, the European Union has its roots in the European coal and steel community. Coal and steel were once the basis for economic growth and better living conditions. Today, our challenge is to make our industries and societies sustainable and future-proof. We have to get out of carbon-based industries. The European Green Deal is our modern growth strategy on our way to a climate neutral and resource-saving economy by 2050. To achieve this target, we need a comprehensive package of measures. These include investments in innovative technologies, climate-friendly infrastructure, and also carbon pricing. We must move away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energies and greater energy savings. Market-based incentives are considered to be very important in this context. We believe that carbon pricing is an efficient way to reduce emissions, and it would be desirable if as many countries as possible would introduce carbon pricing. And yet we have to be aware, and we are learning during that present health crisis, that it will not be possible to follow successfully a path of transition without broad public acceptance. It is therefore essential to consider the needs of those who are immediately and materially affected by structural change. That is why I'm very happy that experts from Israel and Germany have gathered today in this important online workshop to exchange their knowledge and perspectives on the best strategies to shape the transition to a low carbon economy. Please let me express my sincere gratitude to the Israel Public Policy Institute and the Heinrich-Böll Foundation Israel for initiating this workshop in the framework and with support of the German Foreign Office Climate Fund. I would also like to thank all participants for contributing with their expertise and knowledge, not only to the shaping of the transition to a low carbon economy, but also to the shaping of our common future. So I wish you a lot of success. Thank you very much, and toda rabba.
Okay, so welcome everybody here at the workshop Leaving No One Behind, Carbon Pricing in Israel, Distributional Consequences Across Households. A special welcome also to Jan Steckel and Leonard Misbach from the MCC in Germany, who authored the policy paper with the same title and who will present their findings today. It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome such a distinguished group, especially also of really policy relevant actors. My name is Steffen Hagemann. I'm head of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, Tel Aviv. For those of you who are not familiar with the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, we are the German Green Foundation. We are an independent non-profit organization striving to promote environmental justice and sustainable development, gender equality, and democratic participation. Moreover, the Heinrich-Böll Foundation is an international green network which promotes, among other things, strategies for the decarbonization of our economies and societies. And with our work, and especially with this workshop, we would like to initiate a dialogue and a mutual learning process between Germany and Israel. Germany and Israel both face the challenge of this transition. 30 years ago, Germany was an environmental leader in Germany and Europe, and the Red-Green Coalition in 1998 to 2005 created a subsidized system which triggered path-breaking expansion of renewables. In the recent decade, the grand transformation has lost its way in Germany, and at the moment we are also far from reaching our targets. Therefore, last year, the German government has presented a climate package for the country to reach its 2030 climate targets. After months of deliberation, Germany has among other measures, for the first time, put a price on the pollution in the transport and heat sectors and the national carbon pricing mechanisms. And there were many topics that were debated in Germany in the last years, which are also relevant for the discussion in Israel. First of all, many countries have introduced a price on carbon, but the main question is under which conditions carbon pricing is effective in reducing emissions. And secondly, and this will be the focus of today's workshop, what are the distributional effects of a carbon tax? Will it burden poor households more than rich households in relation to net income? So what are the possibilities to keeping a carbon price socially fair? And this is really an important discussion, as there is already some public opposition in Germany to various aspects of the climate package. At the end of my introduction, I really would like to thank all participants, especially the German embassy, for their support. The fact that the ambassador now will give a greeting welcome shows how important it is for Germany to have a dialogue between Germany and Israel on the issue of climate change. And a special thank you to Barbara Seimetz, who is responsible for the project at the German embassy and who greatly contributes to making this series of workshops a success. So I'm really happy that we as the Heinrich-Böll Foundation can make a small contribution to the discussion here in Israel, and I wish all of us a productive and inspiring workshop.
Good morning, everyone, to those gathered in person and those joining us online. My name is Polina, and I'm the Programs Manager at the Israel Public Policy Institute, or simply put, IPPI. Like the speakers before me, I too am very pleased to welcome you to this unique expert workshop where we will explore and discuss the effects of carbon pricing on households and industry in Germany and Israel. IPPI is an independent nonprofit policy think and do tank working at the intersection of society, technology, and the environment with the goal of catalyzing fresh thinking on some of the main challenges facing our societies from an international and interdisciplinary perspective. Alongside our research activities, we regularly create formats for exchange of views and best practices between public policy professionals in Israel and abroad in order to promote international cooperation and to catalyze learning processes and the formulation of relevant hands-on policy-oriented solutions for shared societal dilemmas and challenges. Our expert workshop today is a good example of such a format, offering researchers and practitioners from Israel and Germany the opportunity to come together and exchange know-how and perspectives and capitalize on the wealth of knowledge that exists beyond one's national borders. And indeed, tackling the climate crisis is such a grand shared challenge, which requires not only extensive systematic changes at the national level, but also the promotion of close international dialogue and cooperation. We strongly believe that today's workshop, which will be devoted to exploring the societal implications of a carbon price in Israel, will contribute to generating new knowledge on the issue and support the Israeli transition process to a low carbon economy. I would like to thank Dr. Jan Steckel and Leonard Misbach from MTC, who conducted an incredibly insightful analysis of the effects of a carbon price on Israeli households, and which of course will be presented later on. And I would also like to thank Yuval from the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Lior Gallo from the Bank of Israel for their fruitful cooperation around this workshop. On the German side, special thanks to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation Tel Aviv for their ongoing support of our work to promote German-Israeli dialogue on sustainability. And of course, I would also like to extend a special thanks to the German Climate Fund, represented by the German Embassy in Israel, and especially to the science attaché Barbara Steinmetz, who made this German-Israeli dialogue possible in the first place. I wish you all an interesting and enriching workshop.
Yes, so Michel, please feel free to join us.
Okay, so my name is Michel Strawczynski. I'm the Director of Research, and let me repeat a little bit, but to this, I'm sure that this nice group has a lot of patience, and I would like to start by thanking the Ministry of Environmental Protection, the Climate Fund, and the German Embassy, Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and the Israel Public Policy Institute. I think that co-organizing this workshop is an excellent idea. I think that we are in a very particular time. The COVID-19 is testing the fragility of mankind, and things that you do is a very important way to cope with not only with the fragilities of the world, but also with the particular fragility that we have today, given that the direction of green growth can be one of the answers to the situation that we are in. In the Bank of Israel, we are looking at this kind of recommendations as a way also to cope with the way out from COVID. There is someone with the open microphone. Okay. So we're looking at it as a way also to cope with the way out to COVID-19. Let me say, first of all, that we see ourselves committed to this kind of topics. We have published last year in our report a special section on also the topic that will be discussed today. And I think that this agenda is very important for the country. And my last word would be that at the bank, we feel really, not only at the research department, but at the bank, we feel really engaged in this agenda. And I am happy also to update you that the bank has been, we have joined a network that is called NGFS for greening the financial system, which means not only discussing in research as we do in our department, but at the bank level to be involved and related to financial, to the financial part of the story, which that has an agenda that is related also to the way that banks act and so on and so forth. And the bank has recently joined this organization. So thank you for organizing this, and I hope that you will have a very interesting workshop.
Thank you very much, Michel. Thank you very much for joining us and for these words. Galit, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I really hope this important workshop is another step toward more ambitious carbon reduction actions in Israel. I wish to thank Israel Public Policy Institute, the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, the Climate Fund, the German Embassy, and the Bank of Israel for organizing this event. I would like to put in light in my remarks the role of financial markets and carbon pricing in the economic transition. Climate risks are taking tangible form before our eyes. They pose a myriad challenges for humanity. That we all know, but we must remember that our financial system, which is one of the foundations of our economy, is not immune to climate risks. Traditional financial concepts are putting our economy and social fabric at risk. We can no longer ignore this risk, and we must act quickly. Carbon pricing is a crucial element for financial systems to factor in climate risks in their calculation and models. This has direct implications for ensuring an equitable transition. Some financial institutions have recognized these risks, and I should note, opportunities. Some are beginning to put a price on carbon in their models, but a voluntary approach is insufficient. As Mark Carney, governor of the Bank of England, noted in his speech at the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019, he said, if more countries turn their Paris commitment into legislated objectives and concrete actions, the financial system will amplify the impact of their efforts. I'm hopeful Israel's finance regulators, spearhead by the Bank of Israel, understand the argue and duty to join force and introduce carbon pricing in the Israeli market as soon as possible. Thank you.
Final, very short greeting also from my side so that we can start with the workshop. My name is Aruch. I'm head of the German-Israeli Dialogue Program at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Israel. One central part of our program focuses on creating channels and formats for knowledge exchange and cooperation between policy professionals from Israel and from Germany, as exemplified in today's workshop. Today, we're talking about this workshop is taking part of a broader project. It's titled Shaping the Transition to a Low Carbon Economy Perspectives from Israel and Germany. And it is an initiative by the Israel Public Policy Institute and ourselves. And it is carried out in partnership with the Israeli Ministry of Environmental Protection, with generous support, as mentioned before me, with the German Climate Fund, which is represented by the German Embassy in Israel. The aim of the project is to facilitate exchange of knowledge, best practices between these communities of experts from different disciplines, from environment and economics and finance and energy, and to think on the decarbonization strategies in both countries and generate actionable insights on various dimensions of the transition process. This year, the focus of the project is on 3 issue areas. One is the effects of implementing a carbon price, so the effects on the public and the society, the industry. The second topic is climate legislation, and the third is transportation, and more specifically, the potential of shared mobility and supporting decarbonization processes. The project offers a unique space for both practitioners and researchers in this international setting to learn from each other, talk freely, so these are chat and rules, so feel free to say what's on your mind, and reflect on existing gaps in the frameworks that are currently in place. We are planning on executing 3 experts workshops, this being the first one, as well as publication of a series of policy papers on the topics of the workshop. The paper that accompanies today's workshop was written by our special guests today, Dr. Steckel and Leonard Misbach, from the Mercator Institute for Global Commons and Climate Change in Berlin. Their report and presentation today focus on the effects a carbon price would have in Israel on Israeli households. And we look forward to hearing the results. I would like to thank you very much, both Jan and Leonard, for making all this hard work, for producing such a comprehensive and valuable report. Yuval from the Ministry of Environmental Protection, Lior Gallo from the Bank of Israel for the excellent cooperation. Okay. Yes, and of course, Barbara, the German Embassy, for supporting and for understanding the potential and the importance of this special initiative. Very briefly about today's structure, we will have 3 parts of the workshop. We will open with a status report of the situation in Israel, presented by Yuval Lasta, who is the director of the Policy and Strategy Department in the Ministry of Environmental Protection, and a presentation introducing some findings by Lior Gallo here on his research, some insights about the need for a carbon tax and why the economy will not take care of, the market will not this crisis by itself. The second part will focus on the effects of a carbon price on Israeli households and the industry. And there we will have a presentation presenting the insights from the paper. and anecdotes from the German situation. So some reflections on the Germans' experience on this topic. Then afterwards, two shorter presentations by the ministry and by EcoTraders regarding the effects of the carbon price on the Israeli industry, and by Jakob, also from MCC, on the German perspective. And the final part, which will be conducted in Hebrew, will discuss the way forward in Israel. There we will have Amir Zalzberg, head of the Transportation and Fuel Department from the Ministry of Environment, and Professor Nathan Sussman, Professor of Economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, former director of the Research Department of the Bank of Israel, to discuss tangible policy recommendations for the Israeli case. Okay, so we can start with the real workshop now with the contents. Yuval presented him briefly earlier. Director of Strategy and Policy in the Ministry will present us with the current status of carbon pricing in Israel.
So I won't say thank you. We just heard a lot of thank you, so I won't say another thank you. But I will say that I will try to put the pieces together and show the slow evolution of the carbon pricing policy in Israel in this short presentation. So there were 10 questions that we put in front of us before we started this long journey of putting this policy together. And we figured out the answer for 5 questions. And today, I think by the end of this workshop, I think we'll hear the rest 5 pieces, the rest 5 questions, the answers for the rest 5 questions. And then the puzzle will be ready. So we will be able to present the full policy for whoever we will need to work with on to promote the carbon pricing policy in Israel. So the first question is, why do we need to put a price on carbon? And for this, we did a very extensive economic review, and we found out that currently the Israeli market does not internalize the full social cost of carbon. And there is a gap, a significant gap, when we compare the taxes on different kinds of fuels relatively to their environmental external costs. And you can see the figures down, but I won't dwell in them. We heard about them in the first workshop. So we did that. The second question that we looked upon is, okay, so there is no internalization of the social cost, but what is the social cost of carbon? And we did figure out the number. The number is $42. And it happens to be also the answer to the ultimate questions of life, the universe, and everything. So that we also did, and we presented it in the first workshop as well. Then we asked, how will carbon pricing contribute to the reduction of GHG? And for this, we used the help of the expertise of Professor Ruslan Palatnik with Yele Davidovich and the message macroeconomic model based in Yassa, Austria. And the findings were quite impressive. Carbon tax that will internalize the full social cost of carbon will reduce 67% of greenhouse gases emissions by 2050. So this is a highly effective policy tool, according to this analysis. The fourth question is, will carbon pricing affect the economic growth? And also here we use the message model, and with the help of Nathan Sussman, we did an extensive work on the macroeconomic impacts of the transition to a low carbon economy. And the findings were also very interesting. We found out that even without taking into account the full negative impacts of climate change and air pollution that are estimated by billions of dollars to the Israeli economy, still the transition to a low carbon economy will barely affect the economic growth. Then we asked, okay, so if this is the case, do other countries put a price on carbon? And also here, the numbers are pretty staggering. 95% of OECD countries have a carbon pricing mechanism already in place. other than Israel and Turkey. So let's talk about the questions that we need to figure still out and that we'll hear about today. So the first question is, will setting carbon emission goals be sufficient? And I think Lior Gallo can help us, can start helping us in answering that question from his presentation. The second question that we'll hear about today is, what are the distributional effects of a carbon tax across households? And how can we reduce these effects and lower deciles? This is a highly important issue that we need to discuss and find solutions for. The third question that we will discuss today is carbon border taxes on the horizon? Does the EU is going to go for carbon border tax? This also can have a significant effect on the Israeli economy and a significant incentive for Israel to go forward with the carbon tax. The fourth question will be, will carbon pricing affect competitiveness of the industry of Israel? And how can we reduce these effects? And here, both Avital, Eshet, and Kamara will present some insights from their research on the issue. And last but not least, from Amir Zalzberg, we'll ask, okay, so if the question for all these answers is yes, we need to go forward with the pricing carbon, and I will say from the start, the answer is yes, we should. Don't hold your breath for that. But if we do, how should we implement a carbon tax in Israel? So this will be Amir Zalzberg part, and Nathan Sussman will then put all the pieces together and summarize the workshop and come with the main conclusion, the main policy conclusions that will be presented all in a month in the full policy report. So that's from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yuval. Great. So without further ado, Lior, would you do the honors?
Yeah, thank you. Who's going to share my presentation? Is it me?
Yeah, you share.
I share?
Yeah.
Okay. It's working? Yes. Excellent. So I'll start by thanking the IPPI and the Environmental Protection Office, Yuval, Polina, and Oz for organizing this event. And I'll get to the presentation. I think that our appreciation of your work is obvious. So what I'm going to tell you before I start, I'm going to tell you a little story. When Oz first asked me if I have something to present in this seminar, I said no. And ever since his initial request, time went by and we made some progress with this work. And I'm telling you this story because to emphasize the fact that I'm presenting to you initial results from a work in progress. It means that the results might change. I don't believe that they will change dramatically. Hence, I'm not going to speak about the numbers. I'm going to speak in a qualitative way, okay? Like small effect, large effect, not specifically on the effect of what I'm examining. So this is a required disclaimer for this presentation. It is a work in progress. It might change dramatically. What am I working on? So the presentation will be divided into three parts. I'm gonna introduce some question, an interesting question. What will be the impact of a major decrease in electricity storage prices on Israel greenhouse gas emission in 20, 30 years? This is the time span that we believe that this model is relevant for. I'm gonna get into the model, and I'm gonna explain these questions and why I think that is an important question. The model that I'm going to present provides results of forecasts, predictions, as a matter of fact, on other aspects of the economy as well, on the demand for energy and fuel mix. But I'm going to concentrate on greenhouse gas emission. So this is the question. I'm going to answer it with a model that we have been developing at the Bank of Israel. It's a structural, environmental, and energy model for the state of Israel. I call it 7. It's a name a friend suggested to me. It's a CGE model, and it differs from that was developed by Roslana and Nathan Sussman by the fact that we concentrate on different market structure, while as far as I understand it, I haven't seen a full paper of their model, but as far as I understand it, they got into they made to the engineering aspects of the environment, like how much the technology, the engineering and technologies of producing different types of with different types of fuels. I'm not getting into it. My model is completely top-down model. It's not a hybrid model, so it differs and it concentrates on different aspects of the economy. The answer from the model that we have developed is that the decrease in storage prices will have certain effect on greenhouse gas emission, but a very moderate effect. And this is the main result, currently the main result of the model, and the implication of this result, as I see it now, again, it's a work in progress. We're still thinking about the implication. I think that there is a case for regulation. Once we understand that this technological progress will have only a moderate effect on greenhouse gas emission, it gives us reasons to intervene in the markets and to impose carbon tax. It also means that energy and environmental researchers they're still essential. They will still work for the next few years. So this is the entire paper. This is what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the question, the answer, and we'll speak a little bit about the implication. Yes, Yossi.
Can you maybe start with the intuition behind your major finding?
No. No, I'll get into it. I'll start with the question, I'll go to the answer, and then the interpretation. The elasticities, the market elasticities are lower than what we believe. Okay, you'll see, this is the intuition. The market elasticities, I'm going to show it. So let's start. We start with a very well-known fact that fossil fuel, the ecological footprint of fossil fuel is huge. 80% of greenhouse gas emission stem from the production of the energy industry, which rely heavily on fossil fuels. Now, there are it is pretty much the same in Israel and in the OECD countries. We have alternative. If we look at the coefficient, which is the tons of CO2 emission per unit of energy produced, we see that there are differences between fossil fuels and renewable energy. While the emission from fossil fuels is significant, the emission from renewable energy is negligible. And the question is, if the ecological cost of renewable energy is so low, why aren't we moving to renewable energy? How come the markets do not move to renewable energy? And we all know that the price of photovoltaic cells is like producing electricity with photovoltaic cells is more expensive than producing electricity with renewable energy, even though the prices of photovoltaic cells decreased dramatically. In the literature, we call this phenomenon the decrease Swanson law. It means that every 10 years, the price of photovoltaic cells decreased by almost 70%, as far as I saw. We documented this phenomena for Israel as well. Okay, so we see that Israel, the price in Israel is determined by auctions that are published by the Public Utility Authority. And we have documented a decrease in price in Israel, which means that the Swanson law affects also in Israel. And despite of this decrease, the wishful transition from fossil fuels to renewables didn't happen, well, not yet. And the reason is the dispatchability problem. This is the name that this problem is, right? I see Gil nodding as an acknowledgement. I'm going to explain the dispatchability problem very shortly. The dispatchability problem says that electricity must be consumed the same minute it is produced. We are currently consuming now all these electric machines. They consume electricity that is currently produced in generators in Israel. Electricity must be consumed the same time it is produced, and the consumption profile is such that most of consumption, the peak in consumption of electricity is during the afternoon, evening, whenever people go back from work, they pick up their kids, there are showers and food, and we're heating the house or chilling the house. This is one peak of electricity consumption, and the other peak is during when it's in the summer, when it's very hot. If in order to supply this demand with fossil fuels, if I wanted to supply this demand with fossil fuels, there's no problem. I simply burn the fossil fuels next to right when the demand rises. With photovoltaic cell, there is a problem because we are not controlling the production timing of electricity with photovoltaic cells. We simply install photovoltaic cell, and then what determines the production is the luminance of the sun, which is at its peak during midday. And this is the problem. The consumption and production are not synchronized. And those of you who are not familiar with those issues can say, okay, so let's store the energy. Indeed, we need to store the energy, but the thing is that once we speak about storage of such quantities, it is very costly. From what I saw, the cost of batteries in a system that produces electricity with photovoltaic cells and has some subsystem of storage, the storage costs move between, they spend between 40 and 60% of the cost of the system. It might change from one system to another. And my simulation in this, what I'm going to show you very soon is a simulation of a 50% decrease in the price of renewable energy and how it will affect the market and the emission in Israel. Storage. What?
A fall of 50% in storage, right?
No, in renewable energy. I don't have.
As a note, the people there can't hear this internal discussions well. So if you want to make a question, ask it always in the forum.
Okay. No, I do not have such resolution of information. I'm still waiting for this data.
Sorry, your data is the latest data is from 2016. Is that right? What you showed there, because nowadays the price of solar, for example, whether it is a utility-based or commercially rooftop-based, is about half of that of conventional energy. And even if you add to that storage, at a quantity that is needed to replace entirely a gas turbine station, it will still be competitive. So a lot of things have changed.
Without external costs?
With external costs.
Not a lot of things changed. One thing changed, the price. Yeah. Only one thing changed. It's the efficiency. It's the efficiency boils down to price. Boils down to price.
Lior will finish the presentation, then we will have a Q&A round.
I want to answer. Like this is exactly the criticism that I specifically, not me only, have on the very detailed models. At the end of the day, it boils down to price. Okay, price and quantity. That's it. Efficiency and technology. It boils down to price. Yeah, we are economists. We are an imperialist science. We everything boils down to price and quantity. Okay, so anyway, the prices of as Gil said, the prices of storage prices, just like the price of photovoltaic cells, decrease very rapidly. And all the estimations speaks, all the forecast speaks about a continue of this price decrease. And I'm gonna clarify that I'm not presenting forecast for the price. I do not know what will happen to the price. I see the trend, and what my simulation is as follows: if the price of storage prices decrease to the point that it's zero, okay, 50% of all costs, of all renewable costs vanish. What will happen to the industry? Okay, so everything boils down to the price at the end of the day, and I have two industries. But just to mention one note that I received. Somebody told me that this transition between different fuels is just something that economists think about, but it doesn't happen in reality. So it does happen in reality. There is a nice episode that we documented in 2017 of trade liberalization that the country enabled people to import fuels, and the electricity intensity in the GDP decreased due to this transition, which means that there is some level of substitution between different fuels. Okay, so let's move to the model, and now I can refer to your question, Yossi. So the model that we developed is as follows. It is a model of a representative consumer, national consumer, which consume two types of output, private and public. The private and public sector produce their output using a basket of all the economic industries: agriculture, manufacturing, services, health, education, as well as energy. The special feature of our model is the type of competition within each industry. Most of the time, when you see CGE models, the production function of the CGE model is such that labor and capital are used, and the intermediates of other industries are used to produce the output of that industry. In our model, we have a special feature. We look at different types of competition within each sector. We consider free competition, monopolistic competition, and today I have oligopolistic competition in some sectors, and the results differ from one, which means that from one assumption to another, which means that the assumption on our model is very important to the prediction, and different types of competition in the sectors might affect the impact of the shock. Okay, regarding the energy industry, I'm currently dividing the energy industry into fossil fuels and renewables. I do not have very good information currently. I'm still waiting for some answers from several authorities. You know how easy it is to receive information and data in Israel, right? Okay, so the energy industry is divided into two sub-industry: fossil fuels and renewables, and we examining the results of a decrease in the costs of renewables, 50% decrease, or you can think about it, increase in productivity. The renewable industry doubles its productivity. It's the same thing. You'll see it's 50% decrease in the productivity of renewables. And what I'm asking is, what will be the substitution if there will be some, if the renewable energy will double its productivity, which means will divide its cost by half. how much of the energy will move from fossil fuels to the renewables, and how will it affect the emission. I'm going to examine this exercise under different assumptions, free versus monopolistic competition. You'll see that the results differ. There is a question of whether storage prices relate to the fixed or variable cost of the firms. We examined these alternatives as well. And we do not have renewable industry in Israel. We cannot estimate the substitution level between fossil fuels and renewables. So what I'm doing, I'm taking the parameters that are used in the ENVLink model. It's the OECD, it's the successor of the green model in the OECD. It's the main model with which the OECD designed their policy. These are the results. These are the results, and I'm going to finish in a minute. These are the results. The results show that there is some, under different assumption on the parameters and the level of competition and where the shock will hit, we have different results on the level of emission. The level of emission will decrease between 0 almost and 20%. This is the span depending on the type of shock and the level of substitution level. But so as I told you, I'm not going to talk about the numbers, but on general, on the fact that this is not enough. This is not like decreasing the emission in Israel by 20% is obviously it's something that we want, but it's not enough to get to our targets. Israel was during the 2015 agreement, Paris Agreement, Israel was obligated to reduce its emission per capita to certain levels. It's written all over in this graph, and we will probably reach the levels to which we were obligated in 2015, but we know today that those levels are not enough. We know today that the European Green Deal speaks about decreasing the levels of emission to net zero. This is the new target. This is where we need to head. And 20%, even 20%, our highest level of decrease in emission is not enough to get to those targets. So, and this is basically the first result of the model. What is the relevant tax that will bring us to the current targets? This is something that I'm going to talk about probably in the next presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Lior, for this presentation. In our schedule, we said that we will give some time for Q&A because of all the technical difficulties and everything got pushed. So as a compromise, we think we will do very short Q&A session. So burning questions. And afterwards, if there are any other questions, Lior is here with us, so you can always, we can raise the questions also in other spaces later on. So I see that Yossi already in the room has a question. And if you have other questions, like people digitally present, just raise your hand.
Thank you. Just a short question. I am not sure if I got you correctly. I think you started by asserting that even if the storage price falls sharply, will not have any implication. Is that correct? Or
20% decrease? Obviously, it will have implication. Not as much as we want. It will have implication. I showed you that the decrease in emission can go up to 20%. And that's being said, you need to understand that in a general equilibrium model in which each shock affects all the other sectors, a decrease in the price of electricity means a decrease in the price of energy. Other sectors, also polluting sectors, will benefit from this phenomena, from the decrease. The market becomes more productive. Everybody becomes more productive. So everybody, there is transmission mechanism in these types of models that if one sector benefits, all the sector benefits from this productivity, because all the sectors will have lower costs now, right? The energy cost will decrease. If all the sectors will have lower costs, and especially sectors that are very high intensive in energy, then chemical industries and polluting industries will increase. The production of these industries increase, right? This is one phenomenon. Another aspect of an increase is the fact that the elasticity between these sectors, between the renewable and the estimated elasticity, is not as high as we thought. Well, at least according to this model. I simply plugged in elasticity from an outside model. It's not elasticity that I estimated. Why is the elasticity so low? I cannot. I'm still. I will think about it. I will try to explore it. So I gave you two mechanisms that partly offset the decrease in emission.
Great.
I'll be very brief. Thank you very much. Very interesting work. I'm thinking that maybe it will be interesting also to look at the impact or the implications outside the general equilibrium model, because some of the costs, the basic costs, for example, for the fossil industry, cannot be compensated if the alternative goes down. And by that, I mean that if storage, and this is what is happening right now as we speak, storage as well as PV continue to go down because of improvement in their efficiency and also because of the increase of the world market. Because their prices go down, they can substitute essentially fossil-based energy, and the fossil-based energy is not going to benefit from that. From that reduction in the alternative, because at the minimum price you have a minimum cost of extracting and providing, transporting, and essentially using the fossil fuels, and beyond or below a certain threshold. For example, for oil, it has been named as $40, depending on what's the source of the oil. They will just go bust. And we have seen that very thing happening in the last year. The corona has essentially brought that process forward. But we see that a lot of companies, unprecedented number of oil and gas companies going bust, essentially because they cannot compete with those alternatives. So this is so essentially would be very interesting to take your work and then expand it outside of the general equilibrium limitation or context to a more dynamic modeling framework. Simply because of that.
But if I understand, it's interesting. You're saying that there is some lower threshold for the fossil fuel costs that cannot go below.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that below a certain price, they just cannot survive. They will just go bust because you have costs.
So it's interesting.
And they are fairly high in North America. They are lower in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. They are not that low here in Israel. Actually, quite high because it's a seabed extraction.
So there is a dynamic model with firms that go in and out, with survival firms. I'm not taking it into my model. It's true. It's a little bit more complicated model, but it is possible to examine it.
Yeah, I think
it's interesting. And it's very interesting. Excellent, thank you.
Okay, we don't have, so we're finished with the questions now. So, okay, we're not so far behind on the schedule, only 10 minutes. Jan, are you here with us?
I am, yes.
Okay, so welcome, Jan. I will present you shortly. You also, the biography of Dr. Jan Steckel from MCC in Berlin in the invitation. You can have a look there as well. He's head of a research group at the Institute. And he conducted, together with Leonard Misbach, report, the effects of carbon price on Israeli households. Jan, I will just hand it over to you so that you can present the research, and then there will be room for Q&A after the presentation.
Yeah,
Jan,
thank you very much, Oz. Thank you very much, everybody, for making this possible, and in particular, thanks for having us. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see my screen. Okay. So, yeah, this presentation goes back to work I did together with my colleague Leo Misbach on the distributional consequences across households. So I think, like, when we talk about carbon pricing, not only in Israel, but actually about implementing a carbon price in very general terms, and this is an incredibly important part of the puzzle, to refer to the previous presentations. Actually, how are different household types affected, and also how can they potentially be compensated? Before I go into the results of what we did, let me just quickly tell you where actually we come from. So we come from the MCC, the Mercator Research Institute in Global Commons and Climate Change, which is a scientific think tank that was founded in 2012 and is based in Berlin. We are about 50 people, mostly actually having a background in social science and economics. So a lot of us actually very actively conduct research. Our director is Ottmar Edenhofer, and we assess strategies for the sustainable management of natural and social commons. So in doing this, we aim to identify synergies and trade-offs between different policy objectives in the context of climate change, sustainable development, etc. And I think it's very important to us that we analyze the solution space to inform public debates, to inform policy making without being policy prescriptive. So sometimes we describe ourselves a little bit as map makers without necessarily telling you which way you need to go. So having said this, coming back to the distributional effects of carbon pricing in Israel, so what have we done? So we here calculate the distributional incidence of carbon pricing, that is the overnight effect. So we disregard general equilibrium effects and behavioral effects, and I'm happy to discuss this further in the discussion. We analyze how households in different income groups, as well as following particular properties, for example, rural versus urban households, various segments of the society compare. And then we look into various compensation schemes. So how would actually the distributional effects change if we introduce particular compensation schemes? And finally, we look into typical households. So we have written a report, and I think I'm quite confident you can all already have access to this report if you want. I wanted to, so like the previous discussion was already quite advanced. I was not totally sure about your understanding of economic models. So for those who are totally familiar with this, apologies, but I think it's important to really understand what we did, and we thought a little bit how to explain it in an accessible way. So how do we model this distributional incidence? So basically what we have to say is based on a representative household survey data that cover the year 2018 that we take of the Central Bureau of Statistics, covering approximately 8,800 households. So, and how we now come to the distributional incidence, let me just make this clear at an example of a typical household: 2 adults, 3 children living in the Gush Dan area with an average income and 2 cars. So we use this household data where households report very detailed what they consume and what their consumption expenditures are, differentiated by various consumption items. How much do they spend for electricity? How much do they spend for transport? How much do they spend for food? How much do they spend for washing machines? All kinds of issues that you possibly can consume. And actually, we know how much they spend for this in shekels. Then we use a multi-regional input-output model that we have available at the MCC, which we can use to derive sector-specific embedded CO2 intensity. So this GTAP model has 65 sectors, so we need to do some mapping because there are more consumption items than actually sectors in the model. From this, we get kind of sector-specific CO2 intensities and can use them to actually compute how much CO2 is, if you like, embedded in the consumption. In this particular case, the household consumes goods that are that refer to approximately 25 tons of CO2. So next, we can then actually derive the additional costs that a household would face from a carbon price of, in this case, we always calculate it with 140 Israeli shekel per ton of CO2, which then gives us the absolute burden and can also be used to calculate the total additional overnight costs. Given that we have the total yearly expenditures, we can actually then calculate what would be the share of expenditures that households would actually need to put forward in order to keep the level of consumption they have without the carbon price. And this is now actually the number that we will refer to in the course of our presentation. In the following, I will present the results using a lot of box plots. And again, I did not totally know how familiar you are in reading those. So just quickly, what you will now see in the following always kind of gives you these plots that show you the mean. So this is the average measured for all households and the median. So this is actually the line that divides 50% of all households. And these two measures can actually be used to compare different groups. So for example, the poorest and the richest, or various deciles of quintiles, etc. But then it's also very important to look into the spread of the distribution, what we call the horizontal dimension, even though here it is not horizontal, obviously, but in economics, we call this the horizontal dimension. So basically, you have these boxes that show you the 21st to the 71st percentile, 50% of households in a particular quintile, decile, what have you, are here. And then you have the riskers, which show you the 91st percentile. So 5% of households are still more affected than this point. And the first percentile, 5% of all households are less affected than this. Okay, so that's about the introduction. And yeah, we can use this to compare within the groups. That's introduction. So now let's jump into the results. So what we did is we looked into various population groups. We looked into the population segmented by income, expenditures, by residence, by ethnicity and religious groups, by car ownership, and by the preferred mode of transportation. You will see there is a reason why we zoomed into this issue of car ownership, because we find that this is actually quite an important driver of the distribution. So this is the pure, more or less classical result of the distributional effects in Israel. You see actually the population divided into 10 expenditure deciles. At the very left, you see the poorest 10%. At the very right, you see the richest 10%. You see that this effect would be regressive. So if you look into the average or the median values, then the richest households are less affected than the poorest. And also notable, that the poorer households are more heterogeneously affected. That means that within this income decile, you also find kind of households that are very much affected. So in this case, nearly 6% or higher. So let's look a little bit into the geographical scope. So we looked into various areas. So first of all, if you look only into Tel Aviv, you find that it is more or less mirroring the national effects. Looking into other cities of Gush Dan, they are slightly more affected than households in Tel Aviv across all income groups. Other larger cities and medium-sized cities, so larger cities are Jerusalem, Beersheba, and Haifa, are comparably affected as the Gush Dan area and Tel Aviv. But what is now very interesting is that we see a kind of significant difference when looking into the more rural areas. So both small cities and real rural areas, which would be across all income groups be significantly higher affected than the more urban areas. Let's have a look into different segments of the population. So again, here you see the 5 income. Now we look into quintiles and various groups of the population. So in red, you see again the national-wide population and then how various groups compare. What is interesting is 2 things. First is that Arab households would be much higher affected than Jewish and Jewish Orthodox households, and Jewish Orthodox households are least effective in relative terms when looking into the societies through this lens. And one explanation is that those groups are using transportation differently, living into different areas, being more or less dependent on commuting, and we look into this in a second. So indeed, when looking into whether or not a household owns a car, indeed leads to different results. So you can clearly see that car ownership indeed is a driver to additional costs, with people who own a car, independent, whether it is 1 or 2 cars, are more affected. And then, interestingly, also to look into the mode of transportation. So whether it is people mainly use individual transport, mainly public transport, or do not have transport expenditures. There are also households that do not have transport expenditures. And you can see that those with actually who own a car are significantly higher affected than those that use public transportation. That doesn't mean though that that this is the only driver. You can see that even households that do not have any transport expenditures would still be affected by approximately 1 to 2%, depending on the income group, by such a car price. So, of course, this is now always kind of considering that nothing is done to compensate those effects, and a lot of has been discussed not only in Israel but also in other countries on how to compensate households, how to use the revenues. If you have a carbon price, you usually also generate revenues, and you can do various things with those revenues. You can recycle them back to various groups of the society that you might want to protect, including firms and households. You might put it into the general budget, or you might use it to invest it back. Indeed, and this is an example from various jurisdictions that have carbon pricing in place, or had, in the case of Australia, had carbon pricing in place and then had taken it back. And you can see that basically across the board of these options, everything is kind of out there. So Australia and British Columbia, they really recycled everything, or even more than 100%. So drawing from the budget, they recycled it back to households and firms. both using transfers or tax cuts. Alberta, Norway, and Switzerland all have quite significant share of the revenues going into the general budget. However, with all of them, Alberta even full, actually having these funds dedicated to some green spending, be it infrastructure, buildings, R&Ds, or investments into renewables. I would like to say a few words on the German case. Just as a background, we've heard about this already this morning. So Germany, in addition to the EU ETS, will have a carbon price starting next year, which officially is a national emissions trading scheme. However, for the next 5 years, it will be equal to a tax. So with a fixed price starting at 25 euros and then going up to 40 something. Before then, actually, there is a trade envisaged. So there was huge discussion about the actual price pass. There was a proposal by the government, which was then revised in a parliamentary mediation committee, and a lot of this was about the size of the price, but also about how actually these prices can be compensated. And these, what you see here, are the distributional effects of the proposed carbon price in Germany, both without and with then discussed compensation measures. So the red line shows you the distributional effect, now only the vertical dimension, so only showing the average effects on households, which would be regressive. And then after like parliamentary discussion and the huge societal debate, actually the package of reduced electricity prices and increased social transfer can see that it is leading to progressive outcomes. So the poorest are less affected than the richest household, and that the poorest households are on average nearly not affected by this tax. There was another proposal that we made at MCC, which didn't make it, which was to actually transfer the revenues by a climate dividend of 140 euros per capita, which, as you can see, would have made it strongly progressive and even actually providing a net income or an additional income to households on average until the third quintile. I think what is kind of worth mentioning that there is a huge package that is accompanying this reform, a climate package worth 62 billion euros, of which around 80% are financed by carbon pricing. And this package includes a lot of things. It includes a relief in terms of allowances for commuting, on housing, on mobilities, VAT reduction on railroad travel. It includes a relief on the feed-in tariff levy. So in Germany, actually, the feed-in tariff that we pay to solar, wind, etc., is actually paid by the households, and it is quite a bit. So it's a fifth approximately of an average household's electricity tariff. So it is significant. This will be reduced, financed by carbon pricing. And then there are various measures. So actually what happens in Germany is that there is an energy and climate fund, which is a special post in the budget, which will actually be which will be financed by revenues from carbon pricing and the EU ETS, and which basically had the job to invest in all kinds of climate-friendly activities. It is a constitutional thing because in Germany, like a clear earmarking of revenues is constitutionally not allowed. Therefore, we will have this fund. So now coming back to Israel. So what we have done is that we have calculated various scenarios how the revenues could be used to compensate affected households, having in mind that not necessarily all revenues need to go, or probably won't go to households. So we have calculated 4 lump sum transfers, one per household transfer, the other is a per capita transfer of 795 Israeli shekel per capita down to 100. Then we have calculated tax cuts basically on basic goods and food. So so basically what we calculated is that the VAT on already price capped basic goods will be reduced to 0, and then a second scenario that the VAT on food will be reduced to 8.5%. And then we also looked into 2 types of subsidies. One is the electricity price, and one actually looking into public transport. So let's have a look into the results. So again, this shows you the distributional effect of the national account price now on a slightly different representation, because now actually the change, we look into the change of the household budget. It's basically the same. It is just, you see this now with a negative sign. So let's have a look into the full lump sum transfer, and you can see if you recycle the revenues fully back to the households by a lump sum transfer, then you can make this carbon price scheme progressive, and on average, actually up to the 5th quintile, households would not be affected or even gaining. And when looking into the poorest quintile, then actually all households, or at least from the 5th to the 95th percentile, would be fully compensated. Then looking into partly, like in parts, transferring parts of this, so 500 and 100 shekels, you can see that, well, as expected, this of course reduces the gain for the households, but at least with 500 and it could still be made progressive, and with 100 could be made nearly neutral. With, yeah, on average, rich households here at the end being affected by 0.7% of their total expenditures. Just as a side note, then when you decided to transfer those lump sums to households rather than on a per capita basis, it would also lead to progressive outcomes with a slightly different profile. Let's come to tax cuts. So first of all, looking into electricity subsidies, lowering electricity prices would be highly progressive. This actually comes against the background that poor households usually dedicate a larger share of their household budget to electricity prices or energy in general. Interestingly, subsidizing public transport has little effect. This has to do with the fact that in Israel, you know this better than we do, but we were just looking at the data, and then for us this was a finding that public transportation is obviously only used by a small share of the population. You can see that the spread of the effect now increases a lot. This has to do with the fact that those households that use public transportation would, of course, be much better off, but only a few use it. I should say that, well, of course, if you think of subsidies, then it will have also behavioral effects, and whether, for example, lowering an electricity price is the right measure in economic terms, as it would also incentivize using more electricity, is of course open to debate. Well, regarding tax cuts, again, this would not compensate all poor households, but you can see again that it would be highly beneficial for some households that are most probably the poorest and probably most affected. Okay, final words. So what we did is that we looked into particular typical household profiles. Why did we do this? Like from our experience in Germany, we found that particularly in the science policy interface, it was quite helpful to break it down to concrete households. So who would be affected, how much, how can I relate to those people and households. We calculated 12 typical households, and the results are in the paper. You can see that we varied various dimensions. So the household size, how many children there are, whether it's high income, average income, low income households, whether they have a lot of cars or whether they don't use any cars, whether they are like more old or rather young households, whether they are ultra-Orthodox Arab households, etc., whether they live in rural or urban areas. And I do not show all 12, even though I have them in the appendix if you're interested in particular ones. But just coming back to my example at the very beginning, so it's not exactly the same household here, but basically a household with an average income, 2 adults, 3 children living in the Gush Dan area, which basically spends approximately 2.6% of their expenditures in energy. A CO2 price of 140 shekels would lead to a kind of cost for them of 3,140 shekels. And what you can then see here is how exactly this burden would be alleviated by the lump sum transfer. So you can see that with a 500 shekel per capita transfer, this burden of 3,000 shekel would be reduced significantly to only 640. On a different note, in this row, you can see how kind of the change of the VAT removal on basic goods in addition would then actually play out here. The same when looking into a rural household, like an ultra-Orthodox household, 2 adults, 7 children living in a rural area, you can see that those households would benefit a lot from per capita, from a relatively high per capita transfer, which would lead even to a gain of 2% compared to their current household expenditures. So let me sum it up. So we have seen that without further measures, the carbon price would have regressive distributional outcomes. It would in particular be Arab households, households which live in rural areas, and households using individual transportation that would be affected above average. Revenue recycling schemes could be designed that, at least in our view, balance socially probably unintended outcomes, and in particular lump sum transfers would lead to the most progressive results. And well, this is the results of our study, and I'm very happy to discuss these further.
Thank you very much, Jan, for this very illuminating and insightful presentation with the main insights from the research you conducted, and also to you, Leo, of course, for all your hard work on the presentation and the research. Great. So now we have some time for questions. So if anybody in the room or digitally, if you have any questions, just raise your hands and we will give you the permission. Raise your digital hand, your blue hand. No more from budget. Yeah, but you don't. Sure.
Hi. So thank you very much for those interesting thoughts. I had 2 questions. One, you already mentioned it, but when you subsidize electricity, or also when you subsidize consumption, you basically make the opposite effect in the behavioral shift. And I think that the reason that you want to do taxing for carbon is mostly behavioral, and less to make the right price. Everything, and just to make a behavioral shift in the society, and then input it in different.
Interrupted. Ido, can you hear me?
Yes.
The last three sentences were interrupted. If you can repeat them, and
okay,
if the quality of your connection, that would be good as well.
I will try. This will be harder. Maybe I can close my camera, and then it will be okay. Easier. Okay, can you hear me better? The first thing is about the subsidy of electricity prices, or subsidy of anything that is consumption. It's important to see that it doesn't do the other effect that you want. And this is the question. I think the major question here is, what the effect? Do you want to put the right prices on the effect, or you want to change the behavior of people? And if this is the reason you want to do it, so it's important to see that you don't make it harm with what you do with the money. And the second thing is you talked in the research about the fact that you will have a greater income, and then the question is what to do with it. And I was wondering about two thoughts. One is about, where are we in the Laffer curve? Like, could it be that while you will put the taxes, you will make the consumption so much lower of electricity, of gas, doesn't matter of what, that you will get less taxes in the end? And the second is, from the budget perspective, in the future, because of the shift to electrical cars and the shift to public transportation and stuff like this, the thought is that the tax income will be lower. And then it might be that you will need this money for budget reasons, and you will not have a spare money from this shift. And those are the thoughts. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Jan, do you prefer to answer immediately, or should we take another question?
I think you should, because
yeah. Okay, so maybe answer, and Hila, then afterwards we will move to you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I mean, one thought in advance to the specific answers before I actually go. I think like this perspective that we provided is in particular important if it really comes to the implementation. So this is something that we observed in Germany. This is also something that we observed in many, many other countries where we work, that when you start talking about actually how to use the revenues, then you basically have clarified the question that you want the carbon price, and that you consider it to be useful for achieving your goals. But this is, of course, a different perspective than actually one that you rightfully mentioned, and this is actually what are then the behavioral effects of this? What are then actually the behavioral effects also of my compensation schemes? So I agree that like putting a subsidy on electricity or also on public transportation might induce, well, public transportation maybe not, but at least in electricity might induce a behavioral response that is unwanted in this respect. And this, of course, needs to be carefully analyzed and discussed. You can, of course, something that we did not analyze, but like when looking into this more theoretical literature, which would also be kind of a possibility, and like from an optimal taxation point of view, quite a desirable one would be to lower distortional taxes, right? To lower taxes on labor and maybe even on capital. I think this is something like what we can do here is to show you, okay, how would particular segments of the population be affected? Because we have a slightly different view on this, and this is more kind of a political economy view. So how can you basically make this policy shift acceptable for a broad set of societal actors, rather than actually how do I get the most efficient behavioral response. Regarding to the budget, well, I think that I mean, if you think of kind of the pathway, this is also something I've just quickly touched upon when showing the German results. So I think if you think of a pathway of a carbon price, then it is relatively clear that such a carbon price should increase over time. And on the other hand, yes, I agree that, of course, over time, as your tax base hopefully kind of breaks away, this these revenues might actually be reduced. But on the other hand, as there are more alternatives available, etc., then I wouldn't expect that you, in the future, a couple of years from now, you would need to think so much about compensation schemes. I think this is very important at the kind of, as I said, in the phase where you introduce this scheme. If you transition rather than kind of in the future when such a tax and price is already established.
Thank you for that, Jan. Ido, do you have any follow-up questions on that?
Not for now, thank you.
So Hila, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask regarding the use of the revenues also. I know that in a lot of countries, the use of the revenues, they use it for actually to tend the gap, because you can try to affect these households to change their behavior, but if they don't have the alternative, then there's not much they can do. So in the United Kingdom, for example, they used some of the revenues in order to isolate very poor households, so they will spend less on electricity, not because of the price, but because of the amount of electricity that they consume. Or in France, for example, they subsidize for rural households, they subsidize the change of cars. So if they have very old cars that take up a lot of fuel, they can give it in and get some kind of voucher to buy a second-hand car that is more green and also costs less in fuel. And that way they actually balance the extra spending of the household by saving the consumer, the energy consumed. So I wonder how you feel, this is for the whole room, but also for Jan, how you feel about this kind of solution, that actually the revenue also contributes to the actual goal and the agenda of the tax, and not just to give back the money somehow to the household.
Do you want me to answer, or?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a very important, very relevant point. And just to add on your examples in Germany, like what I have shown with these energy and climate fund, this is a lot about this idea. So kind of providing alternatives for those that are highly affected. For example, I think there is in Germany, actually, like one driver of regressivity and one driver of households being affected is oil heaters. So people need to heat their houses in winter, and like a lot of rural households do this by oil, which is of course fuel oil, so which is of course kind of highly carbon intensive, and like changing this to more environmentally friendly measures would ease their burden dramatically. And yeah, the same with kind of investing into public transportation infrastructure at all levels, at local levels, but also kind of investing into the high-speed rail system, etc. So people are not so much reliant on fossil fuel-based technologies. And yeah, I think this is an important part of the story. And yeah.
Great. I'm not seeing any other questions. So unless somebody wants to ask a question now, the next the next thing on the agenda is to take a 10-minute break, because we've been here, it's been quite intensive, and then get back at 12 Israeli time if we want to keep with the schedule.
I have another question. And I thought about it that like you do, as I understood, maybe I didn't understood it quite until the end, but you do basically you put the tax by the costing of carbon, right? About the costing of for the climate change and sort of. And I was wondering if it's possible to do the costing not on the effect by the measures that you will need to use to change the effect. Like, it was just a thought, like, could you say for reaching the zero in Israel, it will cost me like this, and those are the measures that I need, and I will put the tax by the cost of the measures and not by the environmental cost that we have today. It was just a thought, because maybe we do underpricing or overpricing if it doesn't reach our goals of what we need to do to change it.
Yeah, I will.
I think, first of all, it's nice to have you here, Ido. So in the first workshop, we discussed exactly the issue of how we calculated the cost of carbon and what it should be. Maybe Avital can give you a snapshot, but what we are talking about in general is two approaches. One is the damage cost of carbon, and the other is the abatement cost of carbon. The EU chose the abatement cost, giving a price on carbon which is much higher than what the US estimated when they did the social cost of carbon, which was based on the damage cost. We in Israel, at this point in time, adopted the damage cost of the social cost of carbon, like it's showing the presentation at the beginning of the workshop, which is $42 for a ton of carbon. Just to give you a comparison, in the EU, when they did the abatement cost, they're talking about between 60 to 100 euros for a ton of carbon. So it's a significant change, and there are reasons to choose. There are good reasons and bad reasons to choose each one of these ways to calculate the cost of carbon. We chose, like I said, the damage cost.
Okay, thank you, and sorry for asking something you already talked about. I haven't seen the first bit.
Can I ask one more last question?
Yes, so Daphna, please.
I'm wondering about the timing of the tax, because I'm not sure that the storage technology is ready to give answer to the business sector in order to shift from to that direction, to the PV or to renewable energies. So if you put a tax when the technology and the infrastructure is not ready, so it will only cost more to the business sector, but won't do the shift you want to achieve.
May I say something on this?
It's a question. about the timing. Is it the right time when the technology of storage is not ready enough to give answer to the market? Not mature enough, I don't know how to.
Well, I mean, I think you should, like, one important thing that the tax does is that it signals the commitment of the regulator, right? So also to the businesses. So if you are a business and you need to kind of decide on your investments in the future, then you kind of take all kind of things into account. Do I invest into technology X or into technology Y? Do I actually make this investment, or do I need to make another one? And actually, for this, putting a carbon price and a clear pathway is tremendously important, because this is what we find in other research, that kind of this question of time consistency, of commitment, actually, of kind of how credible the regulator is with actually putting a climate target forward, is tremendously important for businesses. And just maybe for your information, in Germany, it is particularly industry associations who call for a carbon price exactly out of these reasons, because they want to have a clear regulatory frame rather than some vague target that they do not necessarily know what does it mean for my business. So like a carbon price, I mean, it doesn't mean that you need to come forward with a carbon price that is killing your current business model right away, right? So I think you've seen from the German example that proposing some kind of clear pathway, a carbon price that is slowly increasing, for example, can be a way forward. But I think being clear on this, I think is very important, particularly for the business sector.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think now the time is up. So we will take a 10-minute break. Welcome back. What we will do now is we will move to the industry part. Yuval will take over the moderation. And Yuval.
Thank you, Oz. So without further ado, I will ask Avital Eshet from the Ministry of Environment, who is heading the Economic Policy Division. Please, Avital.
Hi, hello everyone. Happy to see you all, and thank you IPPI and everybody. So alongside the issue of how carbon impacts the economy of households, there is some concern regarding the effect it may or may not have on industrial competitiveness. And the big question here is how and to what extent will carbon pricing affect the firm's ability to maintain their market share, to stay in business, and of course, to keep being profitable. And naturally, this concern is raised by stakeholders from the industrial sector in Israel and also from our colleagues at the Ministry of Economy and Industry. And it's a complex issue. There's more to it than just assuming that imposing carbon pricing will for sure result in compromising the competitiveness of Israeli industry. And I will just share my screen. Do you see it? Okay. Last year, the OECD published an interesting review of empirical studies, meaning ex-post studies, that investigated all sorts of possible effects of carbon pricing on competitiveness. And this review shows that most studies found no statistically significant effect of carbon pricing on competitiveness. And there was another work with quite similar results published also last year by the World Bank. And however, these findings are also explained by carbon prices being effectively low because of tax exemptions. And in the context of trading systems, there were generous free emission allowances. But still, those are interesting papers, and they provide some framing to this discussion. First, when we think of carbon pricing and how it affects competitiveness, we naturally think of increase of costs of production as an exogenic factor. And the OECD calls it a first order effect. The increase of production cost leads to second order effects, meaning the response of the firms to the production cost increase. And the firms can respond by changing supply quotas or changing prices. But anyway, the ability to roll the cost downstream to the end consumer really depends on the position of each firm in the market. But anyway, this is just a short-term perspective. And looking further ahead, we should take into account long-term consequences, or as the OECD call it, third-order effects, where we meet broader economic, international, and technological outcomes. And these could be increase of productivity and energy and material efficiency, and of course, innovation. Carbon pricing drives innovation in clean technologies to a large extent, and in the long run, innovation is the key channel to keep and improve competitiveness of firms. There is robust empirical evidence, according to the OECD, on the impact of carbon pricing. All studies report statistically significant increases in patent activity in response to carbon pricing. And in the broader view, setting high environmental standards drives innovation. We see it in our work at the ministry, where we have a program to boost and support environmental technologies here in Israel. We support Israeli clean tech startups, and we see that they develop solutions in response to regulation. And when we analyze the potential market share works that they submit to us, we see that they depend highly on environmental regulation in the market that they target. So to summarize this very brief framing of this part of the discussion, it is reasonable to assume, and there is some limited evidence, that in the short term, we can expect some negative effect of carbon pricing on competitiveness. However, in the long run perspective, carbon pricing could be very, very beneficial to productivity, efficiency, and of course, innovation. And one last point, it is not the taxation itself or the trading system per se that hinders competitive advantage. Carbon leakage happens when there are different pricing regimes between trading countries. And that is why the subject of border tax adjustment is highly linked to any discussion on international competitiveness. And we will too discuss it here just a little later on. I will stop here and let my friends from EcoTraders present the result of an initial analysis that they performed in our request, where they assessed the impact of carbon pricing on local industry here in Israel. So thank you.
Thank you, Avital. Hello to everyone. Thank you to everyone for having us. I will just share my screen briefly. Okay, can you all see the presentation? All right, my name is Ron Kamara. I'm the head of climate change and energy policy at EcoTraders. We're a company is a consulting and project management company in the environment and energy fields, and we've worked with the ministry over the better part of the past decade on climate change policy. So that's just by way of introduction. In this analysis that we were asked to perform, our objective was to identify which subsectors of industry could be most vulnerable to a 140 shekel carbon tax, taking into account the first order effects that Avital mentioned. So it's a short-term vulnerability analysis and not necessarily a long-term vulnerability analysis. In so doing, we looked at essentially the same framework that has been used in policy making around the world to look at which sectors are vulnerable. And this is basically sectors that meet two criteria. One is energy intensity. those sectors that are more energy intensive are more vulnerable to or more exposed to the carbon tax itself. The second one is trade exposure. And the reason for this is as Avital was saying, the carbon tax in and of itself does not harm industrial competitiveness. What can impact industrial competitiveness is the differences in taxation schemes between different countries and different regions. And therefore, the vulnerable sectors are those that are also exposed to trade. It's not enough just to be energy intensive, but you also want to be or would be trade exposed. The first thing that we see is that in the classic sense, Israeli industry is not very energy intensive. If we look at those industries that are generally discussed around the world as being energy intensive, you're looking at cement and lime manufacture, petrochemical and chemical production, paper and pulp products, and also primary iron and steel and aluminum production. These industries, the last two we don't even have, and the industries in Israel are about 28% of industrial revenue. So in that sense, our industry is not an energy intensive industry. What you see on the right-hand side is the energy intensity by subsector. When looking at various legislative frameworks around the world, we see that there isn't one uniform definition of energy intensity. There are some legislative frameworks that define it as the share of energy costs relative to other production costs. But if we look, for instance, at the House resolution from 2009 in the United States that looked to establish cap and trade, federal cap and trade in the United States, they, for instance, define energy intensity as the share of energy costs relative to what's called value of shipments, but it's essentially a revenue indicator, a revenue type indicator. So we've calculated the energy intensity by subsector in that manner. In the House resolution, they defined an energy intensive sector as as sectors that have at least 5% of, that their energy costs are at least 5% of revenue. We can see that no Israeli industry, at least according to our analysis, meets that criteria. It's also important, though, to say that because these are legislative criteria, there is a lot of political considerations that are taken into account, because at the end of the day, it determines which industries receive which exemption. So it is also a political indicator. It's not necessarily a purely professional one, but we see that the Israeli industry is not energy intensive. Nonetheless, we do want to see which industrial subsectors could be most exposed to the carbon tax in the short term. And so what we see on this graph is two axes. The x-axis is the energy intensity relative to the median. So if we looked at the last slide, the median was about 1%, and everything to the right of the y-axis, everything from the right of the y-axis along the x-axis are the more energy intensive sectors. Everything on the top half are those that are more export exposed. Now I'm saying export exposed because we did not have data at this stage, at least, to do the full export and import exposure. Your exposure would be not only based on how much of your revenue is export based, but also to what extent are you exposed to imports of competing products from abroad, from countries that might not have the same carbon pricing infrastructure in place. And what we found is essentially there are four sectors that are vulnerable. Three of them are vulnerable as a result of this analysis: the petroleum products and chemicals sector, textiles, and rubber plastics are all sectors that in Israel are more energy intensive than the median and more export exposed. We've added essentially the fourth sector, which is the cement sector, because not only were they the most energy intensive industry that we found, but we know that they are import exposed. And this analysis, as I said, is still partial in that sense, but we didn't want to exclude them or ignore them, knowing that they are import exposed. Looking at how the tax burden will impact these sectors. And again, these are first order effects, so we do not have any adjustments, efficiency measures, fuel switching that takes place on the left-hand side. We see that the tax burden is about 0.3% on average of industrial revenue. And we also see that those particular energy-intensive industries are also the industries that are most likely energy-intensive and trade exposed, are those that have a larger burden of the tax revenue. But what we've also seen, if we look at the emissions reduction pathway that has been established as part of the target setting along with the Ministry of the Economy, looking at the energy emissions reduction measures that we can do, we see that the industry does have the potential to reduce this tax burden significantly over time, about 40% going forward to 2030. I should also say that this is a conservative estimate. The data that we have, that we had sort of a full data set for all of the points that we needed was 2017. And even since then, we've seen fuel switching away from more carbon intensive fuels. So even then we're looking at a bit of a conservative estimate of the tax burden. But again, those industries that we did identify as being vulnerable relative to Israel would also have a larger share of the tax burden. So concluding basically this part of the analysis, what we've seen is that industry in Israel is not an energy intensive industry in global terms. Particularly in global terms, we would not be considered to be vulnerable industries. If we look at the overall tax burden without second order and third order effects, we're looking at a range from 0.6 to about 1.5% of revenue, depending on the subsector. Implementation of an emission reduction pathway that's been discussed, which is fairly conservative also, I should say, in its assumptions regarding the energy efficiency measures and fuel switching measures that industry will take, could reduce this burden by 40%. And 4 of the sectors, which together account for less than a third of industrial revenue, have been identified as those that are being relatively vulnerable. And relative is in bold for a reason, because it's looking relative to other Israeli sectors and not necessarily relative to global sectors. They would be relatively vulnerable in the short term to impacts on their competitiveness. So thank you for your time. If you have any questions or requests for further analysis, we're here.
What we'll do is we'll move to the next presentation and have for both sessions a Q&A. Okay. So if you can stop sharing your
of course.
Thank you. So just a few weeks ago, I received in my mailbox a letter from the EU wanting me to share my thoughts about the border adjustment tax that the EU is now looking into. So border adjustment tax is not a theory, it's happening. And we would like to hear more about it from Dr. Michael Jakob, who is a senior researcher at the MCC. So Michael, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Happy to join. Thanks for having me. So also, Ron, thanks a lot for your preparing the scene. I think our presentations are very good compliments. So you already talked a lot about the situation in Israel, and I will say a little bit about the discussion on border carbon adjustment in the European Union. So actually, I will first say a little bit about the motivation to impose BCA, border carbon adjustments, and the issue of carbon leakage, and then go through 4 main issue areas that are being discussed on the design of such instruments. So first, which emissions should be included in such an adjustment. Second, how to assess equivalence of trade partners' policies. Then, of course, the issue of WTO law consistency, and finally, the use of revenues. And finally, I will have one slide with some few thoughts about the situation in Israel and how this compares to the EU situation. So, carbon leakage, of course, you already mentioned this. If you impose a stringent climate policy, you have the danger that some energy-intensive industries might just relocate to other countries, and then you just import those products that you put a price of carbon. And this has two problems. Firstly, of course, competitiveness, loss of employment, and so on. And the other thing, if this happens and they shift to less clean areas, you might even see an increase in global emissions. So the worst case you could actually have is that you sacrifice some industries, but don't achieve anything for the climate at the end. This is often brought as a case against climate policy. So far, if you look at the empirical evidence, we haven't seen any real incidence of carbon leakage yet, which can be also explained by the fact that carbon prices have been quite low for most time. And we have a leakage protection mechanism in the European Union. So we have a tradable permit system, and firms that are covered by this permit system and that are deemed being at risk of carbon leakage get free allocation of these permits. So these actually disadvantage against foreign producers is leveled by the free allocation of emission permits. However, there's actually some model calculations that show in the future, if you go for ambitious climate policies, leakage might become a problem, at least for some energy-intensive trade-exposed industries. And there's a huge spectrum of leakage rates of how much of emission reductions is being undone by leakage, ranging between 5% and 20%. So the median is about 12%, if I remember correctly. Regarding the leakage protection we have right now, the free allocation of emission permits, this cannot go on forever, because if we reduce emissions drastically, there won't be enough permits available. You cannot just hand out permits to all firms if you almost have zero emissions. And everybody understands we need some different leakage protection device if you want to protect those industries against carbon leakage. And if you look at the European Green Deal that has been announced, the target of net zero emissions, GHG emissions by 2050, is supposed to be accompanied by some kind of carbon border mechanism. So it's called CBAM here in this context. So actually it says that this should be applied to the selected industries at risk of carbon leakage. And it's actually a different way to deal with leakage, an alternative to free allocation. There are many design features that you need to address. First, the question, which sectors do you include? As Ron has already mentioned, there are not that many sectors for which energy costs play such a huge role. So many industries have energy costs below 1%, or so if you think about, if you have 1% of cost of energy and then energy prices increase by 20%, your total cost increases only 0.2%. And this is somehow also in line with the figures that Ron showed. Even for petroleum, rubber, and plastics, it would only be 0.5%. And this is usually not a price increase that gives an incentive for industries to relocate, because they want to be close to markets, they value investment security, access to labor markets, and so on. However, still, you might have some sectors, for instance, if you think about steel or cement and so on, for which this could play an important role, and those need to be included in some kind of border carbon adjustment scheme. Then the question is, what kind of emissions do you use to calculate the price you put on imports? Of course, the most challenging thing to do would be to go through the full life cycle and include all emissions that have been produced from the extraction of materials to the final product. This is very challenging, very complex. Probably this won't happen. The most simple thing you might do is to only include the emissions that have been directly generated while producing the product. So for instance, for steel, this would be quite straightforward. And a kind of a compromise, which is usually called scope 2, would be to also include energy inputs in the production. So if a firm doesn't emit directly but uses electricity, for instance, you would include the emissions that have been generated to produce this electricity. One other thing that's being discussed a lot here is not to use actual emissions, but to use the European average as a benchmark. So to assume that our trade partners use the same technologies as we do, which would not actually incentivize trade partners to use cleaner technologies, but it would level the playing field for European producers, and it would be much easier to implement, and it would be much more likely to be WTO consistent. There's one other thing. what I call leakage on a global scale, that just global trade patterns are being reshifted, that clean producers predominantly export to the US and dirty produce to other countries, so you might just shift trade flows and not really reduce emissions globally. This is something you just cannot prevent with such an instrument. And, it shouldn't be about exporting your climate policy to other countries, but it should be about leveling the playing field to allow European firms to deal with these climate regulations without being at a disadvantage to other firms. And of course, there's also some discussion about exemptions. So of course, if you have a border carbon adjustment, this also imposes costs on your trade partners. So you kind of shift mitigation costs to your trade partners, which of course is very problematic if you're dealing about least developed countries. So there will probably be exceptions for LDCs, which might not be such a big thing because there are not that many LDCs that produce and export highly energy intensive goods. Equivalence, of course, you will only be able to impose such a mechanism on trade partners that don't have comparable ambition of climate policies. So if, for instance, Israel also has a carbon price that's comparable to the EU price, there's no reason to actually adjust again to impose the price in Israel and a second time upon import to the EU. So there must be some measure to exclude such trade partners that have adopted their own climate policies. But the question, what do you include in this equivalence? Only carbon prices or also other regulations? So for instance, if a country has a renewable energy standards or feed-in system, does this also count, or would it only count for carbon pricing? There are two sides, there are good arguments for both, and this is still not decided. Then technical question here, how do you actually implement this border carbon adjustment? Like the textbook always thinks about a kind of a tariff or levy that's collected upon imports, which is most straightforward. As in the EU, we have an emission trading system. Some people are thinking about not using such a price, but using a quantity-based instrument that importers need to have these emission permits. And then it's not clear whether they would buy it from the internal EU ETS market or whether there would be a second market for actually handing out allowances to importers from which they can buy. But then, of course, it's not so easy to fix the price because if you don't trade with the EU ETS, you might have a different price. So this is still very vague, and as far as I know, nobody has outlined a really concrete suggestion. And finally, one thing that's also quite, let's say, straightforward from economic logic is that you might want to reimburse producers the carbon price if they export to other countries that don't have a carbon price. So not only to allow competitiveness of the local market, but also in the world market, which would also be good from an environmental perspective because, well, let's say if clean European steel drives out dirty Chinese steel, that's also good for the climate. But this is under the WTO law, that's very challenging because if you have trade permit systems and you're going to reimburse a monetary amount to a firm, this is counted as some kind of export subsidy under WTO law, very likely. If you have a tax, if you really had a tax in the European Union, this would be much easier because it's very straightforward to reimburse a tax. So economically, a tax and a permit system are very similar, but legally there are quite different entities and they're treated differently. This also plays an important role for Israel if you have tax and a permit system. So talking about WTO law, there are actually two ways you could introduce such a mechanism. First is as a border tax. So actually, if you import things, you can make them subject to taxes that also apply to domestic producers. For instance, a value-added tax. You apply it regardless of whether this product has been produced outside the European Union or inside. That's very easy to actually adjust the border tax. The other thing you might do is in WTO, there's the Article 20 that allows you to kind of go beyond the regulations of WTO, for instance, in national treatment, non-discrimination, if you can show that this is appropriate and necessary for some higher objectives, so to say, and protecting the environment is one of these objectives. And also in the European Union, we have this kind of complex situation that such measures are not being decided on the national level. So Germany cannot impose a tax or a tariff by itself, a border tax or tariff, because of the internal market. So it must be decided on the European level. And there, it's a difference whether you frame it as a kind of tariff-like instrument or as a tax-like instrument, because firstly, taxes are decided by anonymity, so all member states would have to agree. So it's more likely that they will frame it as a kind of tariff instrument. But then if it's a tariff, the revenues don't go to national budget, they go to the EU budget, which some people find very desirable because they actually want to increase the EU's spending capacity, either to finance green investments or to pay back the debts that have now been incurred with the Corona stimulus packages. And one other thing I encounter frequently by many observers, that the issue of legal uncertainty is very important, because industries are quite concerned that if we now put such a mechanism in place and our trade partners will actually challenge that under WTO law, this could take several years until a decision is reached, whether this is legal or whether we have to readjust the mechanism. And of course, it's quite hard if you now undertake billions of investment for, let's say, clean steel power plants, and then actually you rely on the border carbon adjustment, but then it must be revoked. Yeah, steel producers wouldn't be very happy about this. And finally, I already mentioned the use of revenues. Do they go to member states or EU budget? So actually, one thing that seems quite likely, at least, that some of the revenues will be used to finance mitigation measures in third countries. So this would have several advantages. Firstly, you give back some money to the trade partners, which might lower their resistance. And also, if you clean up the industries in other countries, you kind of lower the gap, and then it might be easier for those industries to actually meet the EU requirements. So also some of the money might go to green infrastructure investments, R&D, and so on. So final slide, some thoughts, what does this mean for Israel? 3 aspects I had in my mind that might be very interesting for you. Firstly, if the EU, which is the main trade partner for Israel, as far as I know, imposes such a border carbon adjustment, you have to pay the price anyway for the exports to the EU. But it makes a difference whether you have the carbon price in Israel, then the revenues go to the public budget in Israel, or if you have the EU BCA, then the revenues go to the EU or one of the member states. So this makes an important difference, I would say. Then from an implementation level, you're in a much more favorable situation than the European Union. First, because you can just introduce it at the national level and don't have these very complex multi-level governance issues that I mentioned. Then you're thinking about a carbon tax, which is much easier with a carbon tax than with a permit system, because you know which price you need to fix, and you also have the opportunity to reimburse exporters if you like, which could be actually politically very important to make this more attractive, to get more political clout into such a proposal. And finally, following up to Jan's presentation, what are the distributional implications of a border tax, border carbon adjustment? Of course, energy-intensive imports become more expensive. So this would actually harm some industries, some households. I don't know what exactly the implications are for Israel, but for most countries that I've seen studies, you can expect that the distribution implications of the border carbon adjustment are very similar to those of a carbon price, because the kind of consumption shares on imported and domestic produced goods are not that different. So you might expect some slight regressivity in isolation. But as you've seen with the carbon price, you need some kind of revenue recycling anyway. And there you might actually want to also consider the distribution impacts of the border carbon adjustment, which are of course much lower than for the pure carbon price, because the share of things produced and consumed from domestic production is much higher than for imports. And final thing, also here, it's very important not only to look at the averages, but also to look at outliers, whether there are some populations or some industries that are highly reliant on imports for some reason or another, and whether they need some kind of special treatment to prevent hardships. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much. And by the way, we have a policy brief on carbon leakage from the MCC, which I would highly recommend. I've pasted the link here, and I can also put it in the chat. Thanks and I'm looking forward to questions and comments.
Thank you, Michael, very much. If you can also stop sharing your screen so we can see everyone. So yes, we heard both from Avital and Ron, and also from Michael, issues that are highly relevant to the Israeli industry, and we would be happy to have some questions now. Who wants to ask questions? Maybe raise your hand, or just open your mic and say, because I can't see everyone.
Hey, I'd be happy to ask a question, actually. I'm Aruch from the Ministry of Economy.
So Aruch is from the Ministry of Economy and Industry. Please, Aruch.
Yeah, from the Ministry of Economy, and on this part, basically mostly from the industry. So thank you, first of all, very much to Avital, Ron, and Michel for the interesting introductions. I haven't seen these papers before. I'd be happy to look into some of the assumptions they use to calculate the numbers. And actually, so I have a few questions. First, it's more of a comment. Basically, there isn't currently carbon pricing on the industry because they were given free allowances in Europe. And now they want to do the carbon mechanism to try and change that. And obviously, when we talk about competitiveness, we have to look at import and export. This is why you use the cement industry inside. This is very good. And another thing maybe I've missed, but it will make products more expensive, right? Because if the industry makes products which will pay more for energy, the products will be more expensive. It will be very interesting to look at these numbers as well. Now, I wanted to ask Ron, because you said that the industry could reduce the price it pays by 40%. Now we know that the target to reduce 40% of the emissions is achieved mainly by reducing cooling gases. And so basically the industry doesn't pay for the cooling gases. It has no carbon pricing. So I wanted to know if you took that into consideration. And another thought I had regarding Michael's presentation is basically if the European Union will have a BCA, so it will say, okay, so countries that have carbon pricing, I won't take money from them, which is obviously better if we can keep the tax in Israel and not transfer it to European countries. But what about the height of the pricing? Meaning, what would be high enough price for us not to pay to the European Union? Obviously, if we take a price of 1 shekel, it won't be enough, and maybe if we have the same price as Europe, it will be enough. But our targets for 2050 won't be net zero emissions like in the EU. So obviously and you also discussed that you choose a different strategy to calculate the carbon pricing. So maybe it will be, I don't know, smarter to see what is the direction that the carbon mechanism is going to set a price here that will leave all the money in Israel. This is
very well. Thank you for your questions, Ron, and then Michael, please.
Okay, so I'll answer the question on the tax burden. The tax burden is from energy carbon tax. So we're not looking at the F-gas emissions or even direct emissions from industrial processes.
But I'm talking about the reduction.
But it's true that it ended up being the same 40%, but the 40% you're thinking of is the 2050 target that includes everything together, and it's only direct emissions from industry. So here you would only have emissions from fuels that are burned in industry, right? When we looked at the tax burden, we looked also at the tax increase on electricity costs. And electricity costs are a significant portion of industrial costs. So it ended up being the same 40%, but it's not the same way of looking at it. So here you have tax burden on electricity as well. And that total tax burden from the fuel switching and energy efficiency measures can be reduced by 40%.
Okay, thanks.
Michael, can you address Arik's question?
Yeah, of course. Thanks a lot. So regarding the carbon leakage protection with free allocation of emission permits, actually what's happening then? If firms get these emission permits for free, they still see a carbon price because there's an incentive still to reduce emissions, because it's an opportunity cost to not sell the permit. So firms can actually reduce emissions and still have the permit and sell it on the market. So they see the carbon price, but the permit has the effect of kind of reimbursing mitigation costs. And some industries that actually can have low mitigation costs even receive windfall profits. Others don't, which are above the benchmark for allocation, are actually for will have higher costs, so don't have full cost coverage. But this, if we introduce the border carbon adjustment, we cannot have the free allocation of emissions anymore, because you actually need to treat foreign companies and domestic companies on the same levels. Otherwise, you would violate WTO rules. And the idea is to really use border carbon adjustment as a substitute for this free allocation of emission permits, which, as I said, cannot go on forever if we go to net zero, because there just won't be enough permits around that you can fully distribute. Of course, you could think about a system, a kind of hybrid system, in which some industries actually keep the free allocation of emission permits and others get a kind of border carbon adjustment. This might be related to the technical complexity of reducing or of, let's say, calculating the emissions. So for some industries, for, say steel, it's quite straightforward to calculate the emissions. For others, for instance, chemicals, it's much harder because you need to actually go to different production steps. So you might have a system where you actually first at least start with a border carbon adjustment for steel, but keep a free allocation for the chemical sector. And regarding the question of what would be deemed equivalent, I think nobody has a proposal. I mean, if you have a carbon price that's in line with the EU ETS price, which is about 25 euros per ton of CO2 at the moment, of course, you are exempt. Whether this also counts if, and of course, the prices are projected to increase tremendously. We're talking about something in the area of 60 to 100 euros in 10 to 15 years. If you have, like, let's say, a lower carbon price, but you have something substantial, like let's say a $50 carbon price, would this be enough or not? Nobody can tell. I think that's a political discussion that needs to be undertaken. And as far as I know, European officials are now doing a roadshow of their plans and visiting different countries and trying to talk with trade partners what they would find acceptable and trying to reach some kind of compromise that's somehow acceptable to everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And because we're very much, we're looking at the time and we're a bit late, I'm sorry, but we'll have to stop the discussion now and move to our next session. Just to tell Arik that you're in good company. I also just saw the presentation yesterday at 12 midnight, but I can assure it's the Israeli way of doing everything at the last minute, and Ron is not an exemption to that. Anyway, we'll all the presentations and actually the full recording of the session will be available to all participants in the next few days. So yeah, so
now we are finished with the first two parts of the workshop. This concludes the international part of the event. And so thank you very much. Jan, Mike, Leo for your hard work in your presentations. As you can see from the level of engagement and all the attendees, you don't know everybody that is here, but these are it's very good that you made these presentations and the input was very valuable. We would say goodbye, and we will say goodbye now, and we will move on to the third part in Hebrew for an internal discussion here amongst the participants. So we will be in touch soon. Thank you very much again for all your hard work, and be in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care. Have a nice day. Bye.
טוב, אפשר לשחרר את העניבות. אנחנו עוברים לסשן בעברית, ובעצם אנחנו שואלים, אוקיי, דיברנו, עכשיו צריך לקבל החלטות, אנחנו צריכים להתכנס, יש לנו תקציב לקדם, יש לנו תמחור פחמן להכניס בו, ואנחנו רוצים לשמוע עכשיו מאמיר זלצברג, שהוא ראש אגף תחבורה במשרד להגנת הסביבה, איך בואו נדבר תכלס, איך בישראל אפשר לייצר מסלול לתמחור פחמן בצורה אפקטיבית ויעילה. אז אמיר בבקשה, אחרי אמיר אנחנו נסגור את הסדנה עם המלצות מדיניות מרכזיות של פרופסור נתן זוסמן, אבל קודם נשמע את אמיר.
שלום לכולם, רק לוודא ששומעים אותי, יכולים לסמן? כן, אני רואה מסמנים, ובואו נראה אם אני יכול גם לשתף את המצגת, ואז בכלל ילך טוב. אז אני רואה שרואים, יופי. אז כפי שנאמר, אני הייתי רוצה לנצל את 10 דקות שלי כדי קצת להוריד אותנו לקרקע, ולהבין עם כל הדיבורים הגבוהים האלה על מיסוי פחמן והשפעות בינלאומיות ואיך זה משפיע על האקלים וכך הלאה, לנסות להבין איך תיראה מערכת המס ביום שאחרי או אחרי שתתקבל החלטה כזאת, וכמה כיוונים ודגשים, נקודות למחשבה. אז למי שלא מכיר, ממש כמה מילים קצרות על מי מדלקים שעליהם יוטל אותו מס פחמן. אז בראש ובראשונה אנחנו רואים פה בצד שמאל את הדלקים לייצור חשמל, הדלקים למקורות הפלטה הנייחים, הצריכה שלהם היא מאוד מאוד גבוהה מבחינת כמויות, מבחינת טונות, אלה מוצרי הדלק העיקריים שמגיעים לישראל, ויש עליהם מיסוי מאוד מאוד נמוך, יובל כבר הראה את זה ואני תכף אראה את מיסי הבלו שוב פעם. הדלקים לתחבורה, בנזין וסולר, אלו הם הדלקים שהיום מצד אחד הבלו עליהם הוא הכי גבוה, ולכן גם הכנסות המדינה ממיסים עליהם הם הכי גבוהות, והמשמעות היא בין היתר גם שתוספת מס הפחמן תשפיע עליהם באופן יחסי פחות. הקרוסין משמש כמעט כולו לתעופה אזרחית ופטור ממס בלו, וגם המזוט ברובו משמש לדלק ימי לתנועה בינלאומית וברובו פטור. המעט שכן יהיה חייב או חייב כבר היום במס בלו, הולך בעיקר לתעשייה כבדה, לצרכני אנרגיה כבדים, ושם זה מאוד חשוב שיוטל עליו מס בלו. והגפ"ם שאנחנו רואים פה משמש בעיקר משקי בית, תעשייה מסוימת, חימום, הסקה. מיסי הבלו היום, אלה המיסים שחלים היום מתוך אתר של רשות המיסים, מיסי בלו לייצור מקומי, מיסי קנייה למוצרי דלק שמגיעים ביבוא. לפני כמה שבועות הסבירו לנו ברשות המיסים את מנגנון הגבייה שקיים, הוא לא פשוט בכלל. וזה גורם, ברגע שמבינים את זה, זה מאוד ברור להבין שצריך להיצמד למנגנון גבייה הזה, וככל שיוטל מס פחמן בישראל, הוא חייב להיצמד למנגנון הגבייה הקיים, ולא לייצר דברים חדשים. כפי שיובל הראה באחד השקפים הראשונים, כל הדלקים האלה, בכולם, תעריפי מס הבלו היום, לא משקפים את מלוא העלות החיצונית. בחמשת השורות הראשונות של דלקים למקורות פלטה נייחים, העלות החיצונית כמעט היחידה זה הפלטות לאוויר, והיא גבוהה בסדר גודל, ובדלקים לתחבורה אנחנו רואים שהעלויות החיצוניות של הגודש ושל תאונות הדרכים יחד בערך משקפים את הסכומים האלה, כך שכפי שנאמר קודם, ישראל בעצם לא מתמחרת היום נכון את הפלטות של הפחמן. אז בואו נראה מה עשו בכמה מדינות בחו"ל שהם היו במצב שלנו, שבו אין תמחור פחמן, והם החליטו להפנים את מחיר הפחמן לתוך מיסי הבלו. נסתכל על 3 מדינות כאלה, ואז נלמד כמה לקחים ונראה איך זה יכול להיראות בישראל. ואני חושב איזה נחמד לי שאני יכול לדבר בעברית אחרי שאני שמעתי את כולכם באנגלית, אני מאוד שמח שקיבלתי את הסשן הזה. דבר ראשון, צרפת. צרפת התחילה ב-2014 עלייה מונוטונית ליניארית של בערך 7.5 יורו לטון CO2 בשנה, וכך זה עלה. הם תכננו להגיע ל-56 יורו לטון ב-2020 ו-100 יורו לטון ב-2030, ואנחנו נראה את המספר הזה חוזר על עצמו, 100 יורו לטון ב-2030. בפועל הם הגיעו בעקבות מחאת האפודים הצהובים, שאפשר הרבה ללמוד ממנה, גם אנחנו חייבים ללמוד ממנה. הם הגיעו לסכום של 44 יורו לטון ועצרו שם כרגע. כמה דברים טובים שאפשר ללמוד מהניסיון הצרפתי. האחד, שמס הפחמן הוא הוטל בשיעור אחיד על כל מוצרי הדלק, וזה בנוסף לשיעורים הקיימים וכחלק ממערכת הבלו הקיימת. דבר שני, שהם לקחו את הפער שיש בישראל היום, שאני לא התעכבתי על זה, אבל אני שנייה אחזור רק להגיד, המס היום על בנזין בישראל גבוה מהמס על סולר, וזה המס הסטטוטורי על סולר, עוד לפני שמסתכלים על ההישבון. זה מצב שהוא בעייתי מבחינת מדיניות סביבה ומדיניות אקלים, כי הוא מעודד את הדלק המזהם יותר. אז בצרפת התחילו בלעשות האחדה של גובה הבלו על בנזין וסולר, ועל זה הוסיפו את מס הפחמן. זה לקח שאנחנו גם כן צריכים ליישם. אירלנד התחילו עוד כמה שנים קודם במס של 15 יורו לטון CO2, ועלו תוך שנתיים ל-20 יורו לטון, ואז הפסיקו, ומ-2020 החליטו לעלות שוב פעם בקצב של 7.5 יורו לטון CO2 בשנה, עד לאותו 100 יורו לטון ב-2030. באירלנד המס חל על סקטורים שלא מכוסים במערכת הסחר האירופאית, לדוגמה דלקים לתחבורה, והוא נקבע כמו בצרפת כחלק ממערכת הבלו, ובנוסף התווסף לשיעורי מס הקיימים. דוגמה הפוכה זה קולומביה הבריטית בקנדה, שם התחילו ב-2008, מ-0 התחילו לעלות באופן הדרגתי כל שנה עד ל$30 קנדי לטון ב-2012, עשו 5-6 שנים הפסקה, והמשיכו לעלות את זה, תכננו להגיע ל$50 לטון ב-2021, בעקבות ההתפרצות של מגפת הקורונה, זה נעצר, אבל זו המדיניות שהם תכננו. מה שונה בקולומביה הבריטית? ששם יש חוק נפרד. במקום להתבסס על חוק הבלו הרגיל, שנקרא לזה שר האוצר ורשות המיסים, הם קבעו חוק עם המשרד להגנת הסביבה, שקראו לו חוק מס פחמן. אם מסתכלים על ממה מורכב המס, לדוגמה בבנזין, אנחנו רואים ממש שרשום קרבון טקס מה הסכום, כל הציבור יודע בדיוק מה מס הפחמן, וזה נקבע באופן נפרד. אנחנו רואים גם פה שהמס על סולר גבוה מהמס על בנזין, כחלק מאותה מדיניות, ואלה לקחים שאנחנו צריכים ללמוד. אם נסתכל מה רוב המדינות עשו, אנחנו נראה שרוב המדינות הטמיעו והפנימו את מס הפחמן לתוך מערכת המס הקיימת, בערך 3/4 מהמדינות עשו את זה, ואני חושב שבצדק זו חקיקה פשוטה יותר, הציבור מכיר את זה, מנגנוני הגבייה כבר קיימים ומוכרים לכולם, ואני לא רואה סיבה שאנחנו ננקוט בגישה אחרת. אז כמה דגשים שעושים תהליך כזה. דבר ראשון, ההפנמה צריכה להיות הדרגתית, אי אפשר בבת אחת להפנים את כל העלות החיצונית של מחיר הפחמן, וברגע שזה הדרגתי זה נותן גם ודאות לטווח ארוך. המשק צריך לדעת לאן הוא הולך כמה שנים קדימה, מבחינת ההשקעות, מבחינת ההיערכות, חייבים לתת את הוודאות הזאת. המיסוי חייב להיות לפי מנגנון אחיד, לפי שיטת חישוב אחידה, ככה שזה יעשה שכל, שיהיה כמה שפחות פטורים, כל מוצרי אנרגיה יהיו חייבים בזה בהתאם לתכולת הפחמן, ואז גם הציבור יתחבר לזה. לדוגמה, אחת הסיבות של מחאות האפודים הצהובים זה היה בגלל הנושא הזה שלא על הכל זה חל. אנחנו גם אצלנו צריכים לעשות האחדה של מס הבלו של בנזין וסולר, ולהמשיך את אותו מנגנון של ביטול ההישבון שכבר התחיל במדינת ישראל, וכמו שאמרתי קודם, להתבסס על מערכת המס הנוכחית ועל החקיקה הקיימת, קרי צו הבלו וצו תעריף המכס. ועכשיו נראה איך דבר כזה יכול להיראות. אני מראה פה דוגמה, זה לאו דווקא ייראה ככה, אבל זה דוגמה לאיך מפנימים מס פחמן בתעריפי הדלקים בישראל. אז דבר ראשון מתחילים בעלות החיצונית. באותו ערך שאמרו קודם, $42, הוא עולה דרך אגב משנה לשנה, יש נוסחת עדכון, לא נתעכב עליה, אבל הוא עולה משנה לשנה, ופה אנחנו רואים את המחירים בשח לטון פחמן דו-חמצני. שח לטון פחמן דו-חמצני, ואנחנו פורסים את זה על פני 6 שנים עד 2026. אז זו העלות החיצונית, וזה בעצם עלות הנזק. ועכשיו אנחנו אומרים איך אנחנו מפנימים את מס הפחמן לתוך זה. אי אפשר להתחיל ישר מ-146. אז עשינו פה משהו הדרגתי, ליניארי, שלאט לאט עולה, ושמים מס פחמן בשיעור של, שוב פעם, שח לטון פחמן דו-חמצני. אנחנו עדיין לא במונחים של שח לטון דלק, שהוא עולה באופן ליניארי, כך שתוך 5-6 שנים הוא מגיע להפנמה מלאה של העלות החיצונית בתוך תעריף הדלק. ועכשיו, איך אנחנו עוברים מזה לדלקים? פשוט מאוד, אנחנו לוקחים את תכולת הפחמן בכל אחד מהדלקים, מכפילים, ומקבלים מה המס צריך להיות. נסתכל דבר ראשון על דלקים למקורות פליטה נייחים, לא לתחבורה, אלא למקורות פליטה נייחים. נתחיל בגז הטבעי, שהיום המס עליו, כפי שאמרתי קודם, הוא משהו כמו 17 ש"ח לטון. אז הגז הטבעי ממוסה בחסר, כמו כל יתר הדלקים למקורות פליטה נייחים, וההפנמה הדרגתית שלו, אם אנחנו מכפילים, שוב פעם, כמו שאמרתי קודם, בתכולת הפחמן, את אותו ערך של מס פחמן שהראיתי קודם, אז יש פה התווספות של מס שעולה על פני 6 שנים, בדוגמה שאנחנו מציגים פה. וכך הלאה, אנחנו מסתכלים נניח על הגפ"ם, שהוא תזקיק דלק קצת יותר כבד, אם הגז הטבעי הוא מתאן, אז הגפ"ם הוא תערובת של פרופן ובוטן, תכולת הפחמן שלו היא קצת יותר גבוהה, ולכן המס עולה קצת יותר. אותו דבר אם נמשיך הלאה למזוט, שהוא כבר רזידואל, הוא דלק שארית זיקוק, הרבה יותר כבד, ולכן מכיל יותר פחמן, וגם פה המס עליו עולה. לגבי המזוט, חשוב להגיד שהפחמן והפליטות גזי חממה זה לא הבעיה העיקרית שלו. הבעיה הסביבתית העיקרית שלו זה דווקא זיהום האוויר שהוא גורם, והעלויות החיצוניות שם הן הרבה יותר גבוהות. אחרי המזוט זה הפטקוק, שאם ניקח תהליכים של בתי זיקוק בחו"ל, לא בארץ, אז השארית מתחת למזוט עוד זה הקוק, זה כמו פחם כזה, עם תכולת פחמן מאוד מאוד גבוהה, שגם פה היום הוא עם מיסוי כמו פחם של 45 ש"ח לטון, וגם פה אנחנו רואים מנגנון מתווה הדרגתי לעלייה. אחרון חביב זה הפחם, שהפחם זה נראה במבט ראשון מפתיע שהמס עליו יהיה נמוך, רק מה שחשוב לזכור ששני דברים. דבר ראשון שבאמת מכיוון שהפחם הוא מאוד מאוד, מכיל הרבה מזהמים אחרים, תכולת הפחמן שלו היא יחסית נמוכה, והערך הקלורי שלו הוא יחסית נמוך, ולכן הצריכה של הפחם היא עצומה, היא אדירה, צריך המון המון פחם כדי לייצר חשמל, ובעצם זה מתווסף לסכומים משמעותיים. אז זו דוגמה לגבי המקורות הנייחים, איך זה ייראה בתחבורה. אז אנחנו מסתכלים על התעריפים כיום בכחול של בנזין, בכתום של סולר, שם זה לא ש"ח לטון אלא ש"ח ל-1,000 ליטר, ואלה התעריפים היום. אז אנחנו צריכים לעשות 2 מהלכים בשנה הראשונה. גם לעשות האחדה של המס, ששניהם יהיו באותו 3,056, שיהיה מס אחיד לשני הדלקים, וגם לאט לאט להפנים את העלות החיצונית, של הפחמן לתוך התעריף הזה, והוא לאט לאט עולה, ככה שבסוף כל מה שיש פה זה משהו כמו 6 אגורות לליטר, אין פה הפרש גדול בסופו של דבר בין הדלקים האלה, אבל ההפרש הזה הוא מה שמשקף את העלות החיצונית של פליטות הפחמן. אז רק לסכם, אני מראה פה דוגמאות איך מפנימים את זה בצורה אחידה על כל סוגי הדלקים, כשעושים את זה באופן הדרגתי, ובמנגנון שמתבסס על מערכת המס הקיימת. זה הכל. תודה רבה לכם.
אמיר, תודה רבה. כרגיל, המצגות שלך הן כל כך ברורות ופשוטות ומסתדרות לוגית. אני חושב שאנחנו עכשיו נעביר מיד את השרביט לנתן, כדי שוב לצמצם פערים של הזמן. יש לנו איתנו את פרופסור נתן זוסמן, שהוא פרופסור לכלכלה במכון Graduate Institute in Geneva. והוא כמובן היה ראש מחלקת המחקר בבנק ישראל ועוד המון תפקידים. אז נתן, אני חושב ששמנו בשתי הסדנאות שקיימנו עם בנק ישראל ועם IPPI את כל החלקים של הפאזל. עכשיו בוא תחבר אותם, תעשה לנו סדר ותגיד את המלצותיך ובכך תסכם את שתי הסדנאות.
אוקיי, אז קודם כל תודה רבה. למדתי הרבה בסדנאות האלה, כידוע זה לא תחום המחקר העיקרי שלי, אז אני באמת בתהליך למידה, וחלק ממה ששמעתי היום עוד צריך להפנים אותו, כי הכנתי קצת מראש דברים ולמדתי עוד דברים היום, אז מטבע הדברים זה עוד יתעדכן, ויהיה לנו עוד הזדמנויות לפתח את הדברים האלה. אתם רואים את ה-share screen?
כן.
אוקיי, אז בעצם אני רוצה להתחיל קודם כל, ושוב, במבט מקרו כזה, רק כדי לתת לנו מושג עם מה אנחנו מתמודדים. בעצם אחד הדברים שלמדנו פה ממשבר הקורונה, שהוא מאוד קשור לסיפור של התחממות גלובלית, זה איך חברות, איך מדינות מתמודדות עם מה שאני קורא לו השפעות חיצוניות. כי גם הקורונה, יש בה אלמנטים גדולים של השפעה חיצונית. אני הולך לבר, שותה בירה, ובעצם אני אולי לא אכפת לי אם אני חולה, לא חולה, אני אדם צעיר, אני whatever, בריא, או אדם שאוהב לקחת סיכונים, אבל בסופו של דבר אני מדביק אחרים, ולהדבקות האלה בסופו של דבר יש השפעות חיצוניות מאוד משמעותיות, ואחד הלקחים שלמדנו מהקורונה, לפחות במערב, באסיה יותר קשה, זה דורש ניתוח אחר, אבל לפחות במדינות המערב, מה שלמדנו זה שאי אפשר לסמוך לא על אחריות חברתית ולא על אחריות אישית. כלומר, זה לא עובד, וזה אנחנו רואים. פשוט לא עובד ולא עבד בפעם הראשונה, ואנחנו עכשיו בגל שני, זה שוב לא עובד, ובארצות הברית זה כבר גל שלישי, וזה לא עובד. כלומר, זה שנספר לאנשים שהעולם הולך להישרף, ושיהיו הצפות, ושיהיה ככה ופה ושם, זה לא עובד. זה יכול לעבוד על כמה אנשים, אבל זה לא עובד. לכן אנחנו חייבים להתמודד, וכאן בעצם, שוב, זה פשוט נותן איזה משנה תוקף לחשיבות להתמודד עם הדברים האלה, עם ההשפעות החיצוניות על החברה, בנושא של התחממות גלובלית, בצורה הרבה יותר אסרטיבית ממה שחשבנו קודם. אז זה נכון שיש את הפתיחה של ליאור גלו בהתחלה, כן, שלמה השוק לא מאמץ, למה לא שוק ככה, למה פה. ראינו, גם השווקים היום, גם הפירמות בעצם מעדיפות, ניקח מסעדות וכן הלאה, בטווח הקצר לשרת כמה שיותר לקוחות, למרות שאחר כך חוטפים סגר שיכול להיות שהוא מזיק להם הרבה יותר מהרווח השולי שהיה להם אם הם היו מתמודדים עם הנושא של הדבקות בתוך המסעדה לצורך העניין. אז השוק לא ממש עובד כשיש השפעות חיצוניות, ולכן כל הניתוחים הם הכלכליים הפשוטים, צריך פשוט לקחת אותם with a grain of salt. למדנו את זה עכשיו ב-hard way, אנחנו לומדים, אני מקווה שלקראת הגל השלישי נלמד, אבל זה נראה שלא. כלומר, ושוב, זה משהו שהוא מאוד בולט, הקורונה, זה לא האקלים וכל מיני דברים כאלה שהם בעוד 50 שנה או 30 שנה או 20 שנה, זה קורה עכשיו. וכולם רואים את הדברים האלה, ועדיין אי אפשר לסמוך לא על מנגנוני השוק, לא על אחריות וכן הלאה, כי יש פה השפעה חיצונית, פשוט אלמנט גדול מאוד של השפעה חיצונית מאוד גדולה, וצריך לקחת בחשבון את הדברים האלה. זה כולל לגבי התעשייה, אז אפשר להמשיך תעשייה עם מס פחמן כמו למסעדות היום, כאילו התרומה, שוב, להבדיל, כן, אבל התרומה של המסעדות לתוצר, לעומת התרומה שלהם להתפשטות המחלה, היא דבר שהמסעדן בוודאי לא מפנים את זה, את השיקולים האלה, ולכן דרושה התערבות, ומה שעשינו בקורונה זה בעיקר השתמשנו ברגולציה, אני קורא לסגר רגולציה, כי בעצם זו התערבות ישירה ולא באמצעות תמריצים, והיה שימוש מועט מאוד בתמריצים, וזה חבל, כי זה היה יכול להיות ניסיון מעניין, איך לראות באמת את הבלנס בין תמריצים והתערבות, וזה מוביל אותי לנקודה, איך כל זה קשור רציתי להסביר איך זה קשור, אבל בעצם לגבי הפחתת פליטות, אז שוב אנחנו יכולים לעבוד בשיטה של תמריצים או בשיטה של מדיניות, כלומר מערכות התמריצים, מס פחמן זה תמריץ כי זה מחיר, נכון שהוא נקבע על ידי רגולציה, כאילו על המדינה, אבל זה מייצר תמריץ בדרך מנגנון המחירים, או לחילופין תמריץ חיובי על ידי סבסוד, שזה גם תמריץ, ואחר כך יש לי את האופציות של המדיניות, זה בעצם התערבות ישירה במנגנון ייצור החשמל, אפשר לחשוב במנגנון התכנון במשק, למשל ברגולציה לגבי איזה רכבים יהיה אפשר לייבא וכן הלאה, כלומר זה התערבויות ישירות בשוק, ובעצם כשאנחנו מגבשים מדיניות אנחנו צריכים לראות את כאילו, להסתכל על שני הרכיבים האלה, ושוב אני חושב, גם ממה שלמדנו בקורונה וכן הלאה, שלא הייתי סומך רק על מנגנוני שוק ותמריצים, וכל מי שקצת מבין כלכלה התנהגותית, או יסתכל על כלכלה התנהגותית וכן הלאה, יכול להבין שזה דברים שלא נמצאים במודלים שלנו, הקלאסיים, כל הנושאים של הכלכלה ההתנהגותית, ואיך אנשים מגיבים לכל מיני תמריצים, אז לא הייתי שם, הייתי בעצם, זה הגיע בסוף בהמלצות, משלב בין הדברים, בין התמריצים ובין המדיניות, כדי להגיע ליעד. לא הייתי סומך לא רק על זה ולא רק על השני. אז זה שני כלים משלימים, ואז מס הפחמן הוא באמת כלי משלים, לא הייתי רוצה, שוב במודל שעשינו ביחד עם רוסלנה, אז אפשר לראות שהמס לבד משיג הכל, אבל שוב זה בהנחות של, בלי הנחות של כלכלה התנהגותית, בלי קבוצות אינטרסים שמתערבות ולוחצות ומעכבות. ראינו את זה גם בקורונה, ובאקלים זה עוד יותר בולט, כי האיום הוא לא מיידי, אז יש קבוצות אינטרסים, שזה לגיטימי, כן? מפעל שמשתמש בהרבה מאוד אנרגיה מזהמת, אין ספק שתהיה לו עלות מאוד גדולה, כאשר אני אטיל עליו מס פחמן, והוא באמת ייגרם לו נזק כלכלי. אין ספק בזה. ולכן יש לו אינטרס ללחוץ על אריק לצורך העניין, סליחה, והלאה זה מתגלגל בתוך השרשרת וכן הלאה, כמו שהמסעדנים לחצו ועשו הפגנות וכן הלאה, פשוט צריך להביא את הדברים האלה בחשבון, ולכן חייבים לעבוד באיזשהו שילוב של תמריצים כלכליים ותמריצים ומדיניות, זה ככה באופן כללי. אז שוב, איפה אני רוצה להפעיל את הדברים האלה? אז אני, ושוב, כאן זה גם דיון מאוד מעניין שיש לנו ועוד לא הסתיים עם משרד האנרגיה, אם יושב פה מישהו משרד האנרגיה, אז זה לקראת הדיון הקרוב שלנו, אז בעצם איפה יותר אפקטיבי להפעיל את התמריצים בצד הייצור או בצד הצריכה? כלומר, ואיפה כדאי לי יותר להפעיל את המדיניות, או איפה השילוב צריך להיות יותר על התמריץ המחירים, ואיפה יותר על התכנון. וגם כאן יש שאלות שצריך להתמודד איתן, אז יש את הטקסטבוק בכלכלה, שהתמריץ המחירים עובד פיקס, אבל אנחנו יודעים שבצד הייצור יש גם, שוב, קבוצות אינטרסים גדולות, יש את הלובי של הגז, יש מלא דברים שמנגנון המחירים בעצם קשה לו להתמודד איתו, נגיד ככה, ברמה של היישום. אז פה צריך לחשוב איפה באמת אני משיג יותר. אז זה ככה שוב נקודות למחשבה ברמת המקרו. עכשיו זה משהו שהראינו, אני רק מעלה את זה ככה, הראינו את זה מזמן בכנס ליאור כבר לפני שנה, משהו זה לא השתנה וראינו את זה שוב היום במצגות, זה שסקטור התחבורה מבחינת צרכנים, לא מבחינת ייצור האנרגיה, מבחינת צרכני האנרגיה, אם אתם זוכרים את השקף הקודם שלי, להבדיל בין צד הייצור לבין צד הביקוש, ובצד הביקוש, שזה הצריכה, כלומר צד הצרכנים הסופיים, אז התחבורה היא בעצם הסקטור המזהם הגדול ביותר, ושם צריך לחשוב, שוב, לא שיניתי את השקף, אז הוא לא כל כך רלוונטי, חלקו לא רלוונטי לדיון עכשיו, הוא קצת רלוונטי, אבל זה לא כזה חשוב. השאלה אם בסקטור התחבורה, וראינו את מה שאמיר הראה לנו לפני כמה דקות, לגבי דלקים, אז השאלה שם באמת, כמה אפקטיבי יהיה המס פחמן בהקטנת צריכת האנרגיה בתחבורה ובפלטות שהיא מייצרת. ובישראל, זאת אומרת בכל העולם, המיסוי על דלק הוא יחסית גבוה, והגמישות הביקוש שם היא כנראה מאוד קטנה בנושא הזה. וכאן אולי שוב צריך לחשוב גם על מס וגם על התערבות, כי פה אם אנחנו נטפל בסקטור התחבורה, עוד לפני שאנחנו מתמודדים עם הבעיות של התעשייה, ששם אני מסכים שיש יותר קשיים, שוב, בכלכלה הפוליטית, אז אנחנו צריכים לחשוב מבחינת התחבורה, האם אנחנו רוצים גם לעשות איזה שילוב באמת, גם של מס, אבל גם למשל רגולציה, במובן שמשרד האנרגיה הציע שמ-2030 או whatever, באיזה שנה אחרת, אפשר לייבא רק רכבים חשמליים לצורך העניין. ולא רק לסמוך על מנגנון המחירים, שבעצם מסדר לי, כי פה בעצם, מבחינת ישראל לפחות, פה קבור הכלב בצד הצריכה. אז כשמפעילים את המדיניות, צריך לחשוב איפה היא תעבוד. על התעשייה היא בוודאי תעבוד, יש שם מחירים שדיברנו עליהם, ובתחבורה השאלה אם זה עובד, והאם המיסים האלה שאנחנו מדברים עובדים באותה מידה בסקטור התחבורה, בגלל גמישות ביקוש נמוכה, בגלל היעדר אלטרנטיבות של משקי הבית. זה לא שאם עכשיו אני מעלה את המס על הדלק ב-200%, אנשים רצים לרכבות שאין, ולמטרו שאין, ולאוטובוסים שאין, זה לא יקרה. אני אגבה יותר מס, זה נכון שאנשים, זה ייתן לי מקור הכנסה, וזה יאפשר לי להשתמש בו לכל מיני צרכים, אבל זה לא, בטווח הקצר לא יפיק את זה, אם בכלל. צריך גם לחשוב על הנקודה הזאת. זה מהמודל שרוסלנה הריצה עם הילד ביאסה, אז באמת אפשר לראות פה, רק להזכיר לכולם, שבמודל לפחות המס הוא מאוד אפקטיבי, הוא עובד, הוא יעיל, הוא משיג את המטרות וכן הלאה. כלומר, אז בצד לפחות התיאורטי של העניין זה עובד. זה משאיר אותנו באמת יותר עם השיקולים הפוליטיים. כלומר, כי בתיאוריה זה עובד, זה יכול לעבוד, יש פה את העניינים של יישום וכלכלה פוליטית צריך להביא בחשבון. אחד זה באמת בקונטקסט הישראלי, וזה יעלה שוב ושוב, במיוחד עכשיו לאחר משבר הקורונה וכל הבעיות שיש במשק, עד כמה ישראל היא פרי ריידר בכל הדבר הזה, שזה בעצם, אנחנו מדינה קטנה, אנחנו לא משקיעים לשום דבר וזה, אז בואו נדאג לעצמנו ונעזוב את העולם בעניין הזה, למה שנטיל על עצמנו איזושהי עלות. כאן אני חושב שהתוצאות, לפחות אני מקווה בתור אחד שמאמין באג'נדה הירוקה, שביידן ינצח בארצות הברית ולא טראמפ, אבל אם טראמפ ינצח, אז אני לא רואה, זאת אומרת שוב, אני כרגע יכול להרשות לעצמו להיות פסימי, לא רואה את ישראל מיישמת כל כך הרבה דברים בתחום הירוק אם טראמפ ינצח, זה ההפך יקרה אם ביידן ינצח, כי טראמפ כבר יצא מהסכמי פריז, וזו הידידה הגדולה ביותר של ישראל, אז ככה שאם הם החליטו, אז למה שאנחנו נשאר שם, כן? אבל אם ביידן ינצח, אני מקווה שזה מה שיקרה היום, אז הסיפור של הפרי ריידר ייראה קצת אחרת ממה שהוא ייראה אם טראמפ יישאר לעוד 4 שנים. שוב, אני מחזיק אצבעות על העניין הזה. והנושא השני שעלה פה זה הסיפור של המחאות וכן הלאה, שראינו אותו גם בקורונה, בישראל קצת, את המסעדנים וכן הלאה, באירופה קצת יותר, שברגע שמטילים סגר יש ישר מחאות, יוצאים אנשים לרחובות, באיטליה ראינו את זה, בצרפת שוב, וכן הלאה. כלומר, צריך להביא את הדברים האלה בחשבון, כאשר אנחנו מבצעים התערבות. זה סתם דוגמה מהדוח האחרון של ה-OECD על ישראל מיולי האחרון, ששם בעצם שוב מציפים שאלה מאוד חשובה בכלכלה הפוליטית, שהיא בעצם הנושא של בנייה ירוקה, ואת הדילמות, שוב, של הכלכלה הפוליטית כאן, שמצד אחד אנחנו רוצים לייצר הרבה בתים ובזול, כי זה מאוד לוחץ, וזה באמת בעיה של הציבור, והפוליטיקאים רוצים לענות לעניין הזה, ומצד שני, יש הזדמנויות לעשות את זה נכון. ושוב, איך אנחנו מוצאים את הבלנס הזה? זה ה-OECD אמר, זה לא אני המצאתי, אבל זה שוב, פה המס פחמן לא יעזור הרבה. כלומר, אנחנו צריכים פה, זה ברור שהלחץ לבנות דירות וכן הלאה, שום מס פחמן לא ישנה כרגע את האג'נדה הזו. אז צריך לטפל בעניין הזה ברמה של מדיניות. זה עוד דוגמה שגם ה-OECD הבליט אותה, כי זו דוגמה מאוד בולטת בקונטקסט הישראלי, זה הרבה פחות קיים במקומות אחרים, שבהם הלחצים על שוק הדיור הם לא כאלה גדולים.
טוב, נתן, לפחות בזה טיפלנו.
במה?
בחובה של בנייה ירוקה.
כן, לא, אני לא אמרתי שלא, אבל יש את כל השדרוגים וכל הדברים האחרים, כן, יש פה עוד הרבה, כן, אני מסכים. עוד משהו שזה האמת שאם אתם יכולים להעביר לחבר'ה מגרמניה, אני לא יודע אם הם יסתכלו על העבודה הזו, על מחקר שנעשה בשוויץ ופורסם לא מזמן לגבי הנכונות לשלם מיסי פחמן, במדינה שכבר יש בה קרבון טקס, והיא יחסית ירוקה, והם עשו לא להיכנס כאן עכשיו לכל המשוואות וכן הלאה, אבל מה שהם בדקו והראו, כמו שראינו במקרה של הקורונה, כמו שאני אומר, שהאינטרסים האישיים הם מאוד משמעותיים, ואם אני מסתכל פה, ככל שלאנשים יש יותר מכוניות וכן הלאה, הם פחות רוצים, למשל number of cars, אז בעצם הם מוכנים לשלם פחות. זאת אומרת, יש פה תמיד את האינטרס האישי בכל הסיפור הזה. ככל שאני משתמש יותר ברכב, אני ארצה פחות לשלם. אם אני חבר באיזו אגודה ירוקה, ברור שאני committed, אז אני מוכן לשלם, כי יש לי את הנכונות המוסרית לעשות את זה. אנחנו רואים פה אנשים שמודאגים מהסביבה מוכנים לשלם, אנשים שצורכים הרבה אנרגיה בבית מוכנים לשלם פחות. כלומר, אנחנו רואים פה תערובת של מצד אחד עניינים מוסריים וכן הלאה, שאנשים שבאמת מודעים וכן הלאה מוכנים לקבל את הדבר הזה, אבל אנשים שיש להם אינטרס ישיר או עלות ישירה במס לא מוכנים לעשות. וצריך להביא את זה בחשבון, וזה בשוויץ, מקום שאנשים מאוד עשירים, אין את הבעיות של ישראל, זה מדינה ירוקה גם ככה, ועדיין אנשים מאוד רגישים לנושא הזה של המיסוי של הדברים האלה. חלק נוסף של המחקר הזה, ששוב מעניין להסתכל עליו, זה האם, אם אני ממחזר, איך זה משנה אני אומר לאנשים שאני ממחזר, ואיך אני ממחזר, איך זה משנה את הנכונות שלהם לשלם את המס, וכאן בעצם אפשר לראות שיש הרבה גורמים, מה שבעיקר אנשים מודאגים זה מאובדן מקומות תעסוקה, אבל רוב המחזורים אין להם כמעט אפקט. כלומר, שאתה בא לאנשים ואומר להם, אני ממחזר את זה, בהשוואה למה שהראיתי קודם, על האינטרס האישי, על צריכת האנרגיה, מספר רכבים וכן הלאה, אז איך שיטות המחזור, הם כנראה לא משפיעות כל כך על הנכונות. אז גם את זה צריך להביא בחשבון, שמיישמים את המדיניות, שפה המתכנן המרכזי או הממשלה צריכה לקחת איזה שיקול חברתי כולל, ולהבין שזה שהם מציעים איזה מחזור של המס, זה לא בהכרח יגרום לאנשים לרצות לשלם אותו, כן? זה מה שהמחקר השוויצרי אומר. שלא משנה כמעט איך אני אומר לאנשים שמחזר את זה, הם לא כל כך קונים את הסיפור הזה. אז אם אני מסכם את מה שאני כרגע למדתי גם בכנסים הקודמים, גם בעבודה שעשיתי וגם קצת במה ששמענו היום, למרות שאת מה ששמענו היום אני עדיין צריך להפנים יותר טוב, אז קודם כל מה שראינו בעבודה שעשינו עם רוסלנה וגם הדברים שאמיר אמר עכשיו ונאמרו עכשיו, זה בעצם שחשוב קודם כל להפעיל את הדבר הזה בהדרגתיות, כלומר זה לא איזה משהו שאני רוצה להפעיל אותו, כי זה פשוט לא יעבוד מבחינה פוליטית, וגם כלכלית זה לא נכון, כי אני רוצה בעצם לתת המגזרים השונים להתאים את עצמם לסיפור הזה, ולכן מתווה הדרגתי, ואמיר שם 6 שנים, אנחנו שמנו עד 2050, כן? בקפיצות של 5 שנים, לא בקפיצות של שנה, אני חושב שאנחנו יותר ריאליות, וגם נקודת ההתחלה היא כנראה לא תהיה בשנתיים 3 הקרובות, מכל מיני סיבות שתכף אני אגיע אליהן. אז צריך לעשות קפיצות יותר ארוכות, כי תהליך של התאמת הון, למשל בייחוד בתעשייה והתארגנות, זה תהליך שלוקח הרבה זמן. אז אני רוצה לייצר מסלול שהוא איטי, הוא אפקטיבי, הוא איטי, והוא מייצר, כמו שאמרתם נכון, ודאות, ויותר מכך הוא מייצר מחויבות, כי יש פה אמירה לגבי המחויבות של המדינה לעשות משהו, גם אם המס הוא לא 100% אפקטיבי בהשגת היעדים, הוא בעצם מאותת על החשיבות, הוא מייצר ודאות, וגם איזו הבנה של אנשים שאם המס לא כל כך יעבוד, יעשו איזה משהו אחר כדי לטפל בזה. אפרופו קורונה, יעשו איזה סגר, אתם לא מבינים את זה, אז נעשה משהו אחר שאתם כן מבינים. אבל אנחנו מחויבים. אז זה אני חושב מאוד חשוב. כמו שאמרתי, צריך לשלב את זה עם יעדים, ולא רק המס, זה עבודה עם משרד האנרגיה, משרד רשויות התכנון, מה שאנחנו בנייה, יש פה טעות טייפו, בנייה ירוקה, עירוניות טקטית, כל מיני דברים שקשורים לתכנון, כי שם המס הוא פחות אפקטיבי באיך אני אתכנן את הערים שלי. נגיד, אז עולה לי יותר לנסוע במכונית, אבל אני הצרכן שנוסע באוטו לא מתכנן את הערים, והמתכנן הוא עובד מדינה שמקבל משכורת, והוא לא מושפע מהפחמן במשכורת שלו, כן? אז אני צריך איכשהו לגרום לו לתכנן אחרת. אז המס לא עובד שם, בתכנון ערים למשל. למרות שתיאורטית זה יכול להיות, כי אנשים יודעים שישלמו הרבה כסף, הנסיעה, הם ילחצו על רשויות התכנון, הם לא ירצו לקנות דירות בכל מיני מקומות, זה יכול לעבוד, לא הייתי בונה על זה. לכן חשוב מאוד לעשות משהו משולב, ולא משהו שכמו שאמרתי נשען רק על דבר אחד. עכשיו בגלל שיש גמישות ביקוש נמוכה, בייחוד בסקטור התחבורה, אז צריך לחשוב בעצם, צריך מאוד לקחת בחשבון את כל השיקולים האלה שאני קורא להם כלכלה פוליטית, כי שם באמת אין אלטרנטיבות, זה מה שראינו בצרפת, זה אנשים שמחו, זה אנשים שאין להם אלטרנטיבות, כי גם בצרפת את רשת הרכבות עשו לה סקייל דאון, תהליך של התייעלות של חברת הרכבות הצרפתית וכן הלאה, סגרו הרבה קווים לפריפריות וכל מיני דברים כאלה, ואז הנהגים אומרים, אני צריך לנסוע, אני גר בפריפריה, עכשיו אתה מעלה את מחיר הדלק, ואין לי אלטרנטיבה. מה אני אשם? אתם סגרת לי את הרכבת, לא, אני הייתי מוכן לנסוע ברכבת, אבל אין, סגרת לי את זה. אז באמת צריך להביא פה את השיקולים האלה בחשבון בצורה מאוד משמעותית. לגבי המחזור, אז כאן אני קצת חולק על הדוח הגרמני, ובעצם כל מי שבבנק ישראל מכיר את העמדה המסורתית של בנק ישראל וגם של משרד האוצר על מע"מ דיפרנציאלי. כלומר, הרעיונות האלה להפחית מע"מ על חלק מהמוצרים שהם נצרכים על ידי אוכלוסיות כאלה ואחרות, זה נון סטארטר, ואני לא הייתי רוצה ללכת לשם. לכן, אם אני מדבר על מחזור בצד ההכנסות, אז הייתי אולי הולך על הפחתת מע"מ כללית, שהיא בעצם זה גם מס רגרסיבי, אבל הוא לא מקלקל לי את כל מיני, לא עושה לי כל מיני עיוותים אחרים, כמו למשל, מה שהם אמרו למשל, לתת פר קפיטה. אז הפר קפיטה הוא באמת מפצה משפחות עם הרבה ילדים, אבל הוא שוב נותן תמריץ למשפחות עם הרבה ילדים, שיש לו איזה סייד אפקט, בייחוד בישראל, שהגרמנים אולי לא מכירים, שאני לא רוצה אותו. נלחמנו מאוד קשה בכל נושא של קצבאות וכן הלאה לילדים, אז ברגע שאני עושה איזה קרבון טקס שהוא פר קפיטה, ומי שנהנה ממנו הכי הרבה, ראינו שם בדוח שלהם שהמשפחות החרדיות אפילו מקבלות תוספת הכנסה גדולה, אני לא רוצה את זה, מכל מיני סיבות אחרות. אז צריך להתאים את הדוח הגרמני למציאות הישראלית של הכלכלה הפוליטית, שהם לא שמו על זה מספיק דגש, וכאן בעצם אני הייתי הולך על הפחתת מע"מ כללית ולא מנסה להתעסק עם שום דבר יותר מדי מורכב במערכת המס, שאני יוצר כל מיני עיוותים נוספים. לגבי התעשייה, אז שוב, פה מה שצריך לעשות זה בעיקר לא להפחית להם את המס, אני חושב, כי אז אני בעצם לא עשיתי שום דבר. אם הטלתי מס ואחר כך הפחתתי אותו, אז לא גרמתי לכלום. אז הייתי עובר שם למחזור יותר בצד ההוצאה, שבעצם הוא מאפשר, אם נתחת התעשייה, אז בעצם כל מיני נושאים של התייעלות בתעשייה, מו"פ ירוק, סבסוד להחלפת הון, שאפשר פחת מואץ על הון, יכול להיות במערכת המס, פחת מואץ על הון, זה יכול להיות סבסוד ישיר, שם הייתי הולך, וגם הייתי משתמש במחזור הזה בצד ההוצאה, בהוצאות ירוקות, כמו תשתיות תחבורה רכות, שבילי אופניים, הצללה, כל מיני דברים כאלה שבעצם תורמים לנו להשיג את היעדים הירוקים. מה שהייתי רוצה להוסיף לשקף, שלא הוספתי, שחשבתי עליו תוך כדי היום, זה הנושא הזה שבטווח הקצר, זה נראה לי שאת המס פחמן לא כדאי למחזר, גם מהסיבות שראיתי שבסקרים השוויצריים זה לא ממש משנה את הנכונות לשלם את המס הזה, וגם אם אני עכשיו צריך להגדיל מיסים בישראל כדי לחסות את הגירעונות הגדולים ולהקטין את החוב הגדול שנוצר בזמן הקורונה, אני חושב שמס פחמן, שהוא מס שהוא מוטל על עלות חיצונית, הוא הכי פחות מעוות מהמיסים האחרים שאני ארצה להעלות כדי לטפל בגירעונות וכן הלאה שנוצרו בקורונה. לכן בטווח הקצר הייתי חושב שמס פחמן, גם אם הוא לא ישיג את ההתייעלות האנרגטית ב-100% כמו שיש במודל, אני חושב שהוא גם מס נכון אולי להטיל אותו עכשיו, לא מיד עכשיו, כשנצא מהמשבר כמובן, ונרצה להתחיל להפחית את הגירעונות, זה מס שאני חושב שהוא מבחינת יעילות כלכלית, כיוון שהוא מטפל בהשפעה חיצונית, הוא מס יותר נכון, ולא הייתי אפילו מציע למחזר אותו, אולי התוכניות המחזור צריכות להיות משהו לטווח הבינוני, אני קורא לזה. זה מה שהייתי בעקבות הקורונה ובעקבות הגירעונות הענקיים, והעובדה שזה לא הולך להיגמר מחר בבוקר, אז הייתי דוחת את ענייני המחזור, ובסוף יש את הנקודה שגם עלתה בהרצאה האחרונה של הדובר הגרמני, וגם הדברים שהמשרד אומר, אני חושב שצריך גם להיערך לאפשרות שגם היא נדחתה, אני חושב קצת בגלל הקורונה, של בעצם הטלת מכסים ירוקים באירופה, ואיך אנחנו מתמודדים עם זה בישראל. זה התובנות שלי ככה, so far.
תודה רבה נתן.
תודה.
אם אתה יכול להפסיק את השיירינג של המסך.
כן,
אני רוצה, בגלל שאני מכבד את הזמן של כולם, אני רוצה שנעשה סיום, נעשה closure לסדנה הזאת, ומה שאני מציע, אני יודע שלהרבה אנשים יש מה להגיד פה מהרבה משרדים, אני מציע שאנחנו עכשיו הצוות שבעצם מוביל את הכתיבה של נייר המדיניות, נתן זוסמן ועוד צוות רחב מהמשרד, אנחנו נעשה פגישות בילטרליות עם השחקנים השונים, עם משרד האנרגיה ומשרד הכלכלה ומשרד האוצר, כמובן בנק ישראל ומשרד התחבורה, כל מי שרלוונטי לנושא הזה, אנחנו נעשה פגישות בילטרליות כדי לשמוע את הדעות. אנחנו עד כנס אליורוביץ הולכים להשלים את הטיוטה של נייר המדיניות, אנחנו נעביר לכם אותה כמובן, ואני רוצה באמת להודות לכולכם, קודם כל על הזמן, על ההקשבה, על התרומה שלכם בכל התהליך הזה שאנחנו עושים בשנה האחרונה. אני חושב שהיו שתי סדנאות מאוד מאוד אינפורמטיביות, מקצועיות, עם חומרים ברמה הכי גבוהה שאנחנו יודעים לייצר, אז תודה רבה גם לבנק ישראל, לליאור ולכל הצוות, לאדי ולמישל ולכולם, ממש תודה מה?
מישל זה במילה, לא?
מישל, כן, אני אומר אדי, אז אני כבר אומר מישל.
אדי זה במילה, ומישל זה
ומהמשרד להגנת הסביבה כמובן לאביטל ולאמיר ולגיל ולגלית ולעוד הרבה שחקנים, למכון IPPI שבעצם אנחנו ממשיכים פה שותפות. תודה עוז, תודה פולינה. זהו עוז, אתה סוגר דברים.
וכמובן להייניך-בל ולשגרירות גרמניה על התמיכה בפרויקט הזה. אפרופו הפרויקט, וגם שוב פעם תודה רבה מהצד שלנו לכל מי שהשתתף בסדנה הזו ובסדנה הקודמת גם. הסדנה הזו, כמו שציינתי בהתחלה, היא הראשונה מסדרה של 3 סדנות שידעו, כמו שגם נתן נראה במצגת של אמיר, בנושא של התחבורה, תהיה לנו סדנה שתתמקד בנושא הספציפית במגזר של סקטור התחבורה, חלק מהתהליך המעבר לכלכלה דלת פחמן ועל חקיקת אקלים, עם גיל פה מהמשרד ועם אמיר שיציג. כמובן, יש לכם לחלק מכם עניין מיוחד בכל נושא של מס פחמן, אבל כמובן שנשמח שתישארו בלופ גם לקראת הסדנאות הבאות, ואנחנו גם נפרסם את השורה של המחקרים ונשתף את כל הפרסומים יחד איתכם, כנ"ל לגבי המצגות שהוצגו פה היום במהלך הסדנה, ושתוכלו להמשיך להפיק ערך מכל הידע שנצבר פה. וזהו, באמת אני גם מצטרף לדברים של יובל שהיה מאוד מוצלח, וגם תודות להשתתפות שלכם. תודה רבה לכולם, ונהיה בקשר בקרוב. תודה.